and people online. And we are recording in progress. So thank you very much. This is the transformative group. So I hope you're in the mood to transform and welcome everybody. Tom is not able to be with us today. He has his mother is not well. And so we had to extend his time in Florida. But we said we would carry on without him, and he's sorry he can't make it. So with that, I will turn it over to Barrick and Carrie to talk about today's agenda and moving forward.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, everybody joining us in person and online. You should have received the agenda, but I'll just going to give a high level. We're going to share out the member input we received in response to the survey, particularly as it relates to the topics we'll be discussing today, which brings me to that. Our primary topics today are going to be talking about the mission of any future entity or entities based on some drafts that we've received from the members. We'll then talk about the structure of the entity or entities. And finally, we'll go into a discussion of the objectives and duties of the entity or entities. To inform these, we're going to share a few things. One, the member input as it relates to these topics. And I want to flag the members have provided input that we requested on some other issues, like where to house the entity or entities, as well as membership. We've recorded that and we'll hold that until we have the conversations on that, which will be our next discussions. So we'll be going over some of the members' proposals or drafts on mission. We'll share what has been some of the historic guiding language for the CCJJ. And as we get into the discussion of purpose or duties, we'll share both what was historically required of CCJJ, some initial ideas from our chair, as well as some examples of how other states describe it. When we get to that, I think it's important to note that not every state describes it the same. Some are very specific in what their entities are required to do. Others are more high level at the purpose, but we'll walk through all of that. The goal today is really to see if we can't come to alignment on the fundamental elements of the mission and of the structure and of the duties of these, and use that to then inform who should comprise each of these. So that is the intention of today. I'll start with the presentation of member inputs. But before I do, let me pause to see if there's any questions in the room or online.
I just have one comment. As I was studying other states and as I was studying the CCJJ's enabling, we had talked about mission, but it seemed to me that the subcategory under mission, if you think of mission as the aspirational goal, that there should be conversations, and the statute now and other states talk about duties, and those are the more specific things, like, look at race, look at prison population, look at diversity, look at reentry, those are the more specific topics. And so I want us to be able to think about mission as kind of the aspirational overarching. And then when we talk about duties, some guidelines to this group about those kinds of things that they should include. But of course, we always include, but are not limited to. So, but think about that in our discussion after when we're talking about mission, which again is going to be aspirational and not super detailed about duties or responsibilities or objectives or whatever you want to call it. Different states use different terminology for that in addition to mission. So Barrick, why don't you go forward with some of the survey responses?
And I'm going to go ahead and share screen. You'll see that a lot of the initial input that I'm going to share is around mission. So I am going to go through these. We also have those input or those draft suggestions printed out. So when we then move to the discussion of mission, we'll hand those out and we'll drop it in the chat to everybody online, but it'll be one piece of what we talk through here. I can get my share screen to cooperate. So I'm going to go through all of the member input that relates to the topics we're discussing today. You'll see on the slides, there are two that are italicized. I'll read through these. Those two were added after we printed them out, so I wanted to call those out. We'll get them in your handouts going forward. But let me just go through these. The first suggestion, the mission of a new entity is to connect and collaborate with diverse community and system stakeholders across Colorado on criminal justice and juvenile justice issues in order to study, analyze, and evaluate the current criminal justice and juvenile justice systems and recommend policies that will make those systems more effective in making Colorado a safe, healthy place to live. Next suggestion, to oversee legislative changes and best practices to existing legislation and to implement new creative approaches to reduce the recidivism rate within the criminal justice system and to find and develop programs to help prevent pathways into criminal activities, all the while acknowledging the impact of violence on victims and survivors. This entity and all subcommittees will embrace both evidence-based data along with the creative process when implementing new policies and practices and or making changes to current legislation. Next, it seems that the mission should be based on the role or scope of the entity or entities. I would like to see language in the mission about being evidence-based criminal legal reform. Next, through a thoughtful and inclusive stakeholder-driven process, the entities shall produce reasonable public policy recommendations to the legislature and departments that are evidence-based, informed, that balances the values of safety for all citizens and visitors in Colorado, reduction in incarceration of low to medium risk individuals, and increases successful reentry after incarceration for adults and juveniles. Next suggestion. The mission should be to address the root causes of criminal behavior and reform the criminal justice system holistically through strategic alliances among and between state agencies to introduce and support legislation that creates communities that no longer breed criminal behavior out of necessity to survive, and also communities prepared to receive those returning from incarceration and assist them on the road to reintegration. Next, I believe the mission should be to a holistic look at the criminal justice system. I know this is a vague statement, but I believe the entities need to be given the authority to examine all aspects of the criminal justice system. We have a second slide, and again, when we discuss mission, we'll hand all of these out. To consistently analyze, repair, and improve the criminal and juvenile justice system in order to achieve a fair, balanced, and elite approach for healing our communities, reducing crime, and lowering recidivism. Next, to facilitate the collaborative construction of reform legislation across interested stakeholders in Colorado, to provide an accessible forum for deliberative discussion of possible criminal justice policies that the General Assembly may enact or that criminal justice agencies may pursue operationally. Next, dedicated to advancing a fair, just, and compassionate criminal and juvenile justice system that aims to prioritize fairness, rehabilitation, and the overall well-being of individuals and communities through promoting equity, empowering rehabilitation, protecting human rights, community engagement, youth-centric approach, policy advocacy, and educating and raising public awareness. To facilitate the collaborative construction of reform legislation across interested stakeholders in Colorado. Next, to provide meaningful and effective public policy recommendations for consideration by the legislature in furtherance of a just, equitable, humane, and effective justice system designed to meet the needs and concerns of all Coloradans in regard to crime prevention, crime intervention, community security, comprehensive system services, and positive system outcomes with an ongoing dedication to the overall well-being and health of all communities. Next, promote crime prevention and improve outcomes for people involved in the criminal and juvenile justice systems through collaborative stakeholder engagement and evidence-based research. Next, the mission statement presumes an oversight commission is structurally over bifurcated stakeholder groups working on tasks either specific to topic, such as reentry, recidivism, victim compensation, behavioral health, or target, either the adults or juveniles. In my mind, the Oversight Commission would be permanent and the stakeholder groups would be task-oriented and time-limited. Finally, on this subject of mission, statewide reform effort that upholds justice, addresses inequities, and makes policy recommendations to the legislature. That is the end of our mission statement input that we've received. And again, I'm going to move on to the other member input because we're going to have an entire discussion specific to mission. And at that time, we'll hand out all of this in a printed format for everybody to be looking at. The next topic was around structure, and we received more limited input on this. It was primarily around the numbers, and you'll see we had suggestions ranging from 9 to 11 members, ideally 20 or less. Someone said they're not sure yet, but I think we need a core group and alliances as the need dictates, maybe 15 to 20 people. The next was at 21. The next suggestion on structure was 9 for the steering committee that we've talked about, and we've called it steering, we've called it coordinating council, we called it different terms. And then a larger subgroup of subcommittee size should be determined by those committees. Somebody said 11 to 17, big enough to be diverse, small enough to be manageable. On other notes, and again, I want to flag for those of you online and in the room, we did solicit and receive input on things like membership and where the entities should be housed. We're holding those comments until we have the dedicated conversations on those, but we did receive input on that. On other notes, somebody mentioned that if this entity is to live in perpetuity or close to it, it must become independent. That to achieve independence, both the legislative and executive branches should allocate dollars to it. And in addition, the entity should write its own grants, perhaps form its own 501c3. Somebody else said no member of the entity should be on any subcommittee. Subcommittees will be formed on an as-needed basis consisting of known professionals in the subject matter being addressed and must include a victim survivor and a person with lived experience. The entity and all subcommittees will embrace both evidence-based data along with the creative process when implementing new policies and practices and or making changes to current legislation. Somebody noted that there were many comments in public testimony about the location and time of meeting, along with many comments regarding compensating certain members, like those with lived experience, non-profit employees who don't have earmarked funding but are an important voice to lend. They say, I hope this will be considered as the structure is contemplated. Somebody mentioned a good facilitator is a must. Doesn't need to be a criminal justice expert, just a facilitation expert. I'm a little embarrassed here. They say the current one has been doing a good job. We'll take that, and I will not weigh in on that.
Did you make
I
that? Did you write that comment? Or you had Carrie write it?
I did not, so we'll leave it there. On other notes, to reduce crime, you have to address the causes of criminal behavior, and those are multifaceted and cross over many state agencies. It isn't enough to look at just crime bills or just bills related to prisons or victims or parole or. For real results, we stop things before they start. Providing meaningful diversion programming and ensuring adequate health care, mental health care, food, housing, education, and supports to avoid criminality in the first place. If that doesn't work, then we invest in robust youth and adult diversion systems. If those don't work, then the last option is prisons. In our prisons, we can continue to invest in education and resiliency programming. But then again, we need to focus on what is in the community for their return. The entity needs to focus on the barriers to reentry. Can people get jobs really? What can we do to eliminate unnecessary background checks? What about housing? Is a good credit score really needed as a factor for rental? Can we eliminate some of these things? Having an application only available online isn't helpful if you've just released from prison and don't have a computer. These are multi-agency issues and need multi-agency collaborative, alliance-driven legislation. Somebody said, I still have concerns over a governing body. I believe there should be 3 tiers or pillars with a representative from each that provides the final votes to the legislature or to concerned parties. And finally, structure should focus on the causes of justice involvement, implementation, and the community impact of mandated reforms. I'm going to stop sharing the screen then because next we will go into a discussion specifically about mission. But I want to pause there and ask if anybody has any questions about the member input that we shared there. And we're happy to share that in digital format so everybody gets it. We were receiving it up till this morning, so we got it into the PowerPoint. Again, I did not share what people offered in terms of specific membership or where things are housed. We kept it to the topics of discussion today around duties, mission, and structure. But does anybody online or in the room have questions or want to revisit anything that was on screen there?
Well, my only comment is we have a lot of word salad. You know, we have a lot of words here, a lot of overlap in that, and it's saying a lot of people saying the same thing, just in different ways. So I am actually going to go to mine and tell you why, because I think some people did maybe what my goal was a little better. But I'm going to tell you my thoughts as it related to the testimony. So if we could go to that first page.
Absolutely. And if it's okay with you, we'll go ahead and pass out the full packet of the draft statements.
Right. That'd be great to do it now, because I think we need to try to capture mission. Um, are we talking duties now? Should we
No,
put up
mission and then duties.
just, okay, because
We can do
again,
structure then duties, but we can, if you'd like to adjust the order.
yeah, I'm thinking, I just want to show the current CCJJ statute, which I think you have, okay, and how it distinguishes on mission and objectives or duties. Other states call it objectives. We, in our language, called it duties.
Me to pull up the CCJJ mission and duties.
Yeah. What it was now, because we don't have that, what the mission was.
And for the benefit of those online, I'm sharing the screen. I'll also go ahead and just read these quickly. The mission of CCJJ prior to sunsetting, the mission of the commission is to enhance public safety, to ensure justice, and to ensure protection of the rights of victims through the cost-effective use of public resources. The work of the commission will focus on evidence-based recidivism reduction initiatives and the cost-effective expenditure of limited criminal justice funds.
Thanks.
And then we also had, did you want to go to the duties now?
Yeah, just generally so people know what it was.
The duties is identified for CCJJ to conduct an empirical analysis of and collect evidence-based data on sentencing policies and practices. There's some more detail. I'm just going to go through these though. To investigate effective alternatives to incarceration, the factors contributing to recidivism, evidence-based recidivism reduction initiatives, and cost-effective crime prevention programs. To make an annual report of findings and recommendations, including evidence-based analysis. To study and evaluate the outcomes of commission recommendations as implemented. To conduct and review studies, including but not limited to, regarding work and resources compiled for other policies and practices in the criminal and juvenile justice systems. The commission shall prioritize areas of study based on the potential impact on crime and corrections and the resources available to conduct the work. The commission shall include among these areas of study the reduction of racial and ethnic disparities with the criminal and juvenile justice systems, to work with other state-established boards, task forces, or commissions that study or address criminal justice issues. Using empirical analysis and evidence-based data, the commission shall study sentences in Colorado. Commission shall establish advisory committees that focus on specific subject matters and make recommendations to the full commission. The last two, the commission, at its discretion, may respond to inquiries referred by members of the General Assembly, the governor, and the Chief Justice of the Colorado Supreme Court as resources allow, and additional duties as assigned by the executive and/or legislative branches. Madam Chair,
Okay.
should I bring it all the way back to the beginning to your draft?
Sure.
We're looking at the top italicized, which would be the mission of the new entity is to connect and collaborate with diverse community and system stakeholders across Colorado on criminal justice and juvenile justice issues in order to study, analyze, and evaluate the current criminal justice and juvenile justice systems and recommend policies that will make those systems more effective in making Colorado a safe and healthy place to live.
Okay. So I think we should look at all these and give you time to talk about all of them. But I'll tell you my reason. To connect and collaborate with diverse meant to me the work is not done. What they have to do is reach out. I mean, that it's not just we talk among ourselves about this, that it is their duty to connect and collaborate with the diverse communities, which we heard a lot of testimony about, and system stakeholders, which we also heard, across Colorado, rural, urban, in CJ and criminal justice and juvenile justice issues. So the mission would be for the oversight body. And then I'm asking if we do adult and juvenile, do they each need their own missions or not? We'll have to get there, I suppose. Um, to study, analyze, and evaluate and recommend policies will make systems more effective, which is where we are. We're transformational. We're there for change. We're there for effective. We can throw in evidence-based, other things there too. But we not only want to talk about safety, but we want to talk about health. And I think that was an issue that a lot of the testimony talked about was, as we deal with behavioral health issues, as we deal with mental health issues, whatever, we also have to concentrate not only on safety, but the health of our communities and the people in them. So that was my stealing a little bit from Utah about that, but trying also to stay at a higher level, but bring in the fact that it is an outreach group and study and analyze and do the work for change. It's not to protect the status quo. So that's where I started. There's a couple others that I really liked that I thought also captured that. Um, 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 Addressing the mission should be to address the root causes, but also I think I'm not particularly wedded to oversee legislative and changes because that suggests we look at all the bills related to criminal justice and some have an oversight responsibility there. Address the root causes and reform criminal justice or juvenile holistically. I think that really captures a lot. And yeah, the one, like the fourth one down, to provide meaningful and effective policy recommendations for consideration by the legislature. But I think it's also, to be implemented by the executive branch. So that also has to be in there. To meet the needs and concerns of all Coloradans with regard to prevention, intervention, security, systems, services, positive system outcomes with ongoing dedication to overall well-being and health of all communities. I think that captures, some of my concerns about making sure we talk about health and well-being and wellness, because that's really also what we want to do. So I liked some of the things in the old mission, but I don't think it's good for now. It actually requests more about use of resources, the current statute, than I think the CCJJ ever did. I think that CCJJ never waded into Director Stansel's budget and how to better use his resources, or the DCJ's budget or whatever, or anybody else's budget, or whether or not this was going to save money. I think CCJ, so that's an interesting thing to have been in there. And I don't know whether we're going to put that in there. I know at the time CCJJ was created, Christy Donner from CCJRC wrote a letter to the governor saying there needs to be more about prison population management as a goal to decrease the number of people incarcerated. That was not included. So I'm talking a lot now, but I'm throwing out ideas of, where I got to from mission vis-a-vis the old mission, and some of the ideas that I think are strong and some that aren't that great, and some of the things here.
So why don't we open it up to members? And as I do, just a reminder to anybody online, if you're a member of TCJJ and you're in a place where it's safe and comfortable for you to do so, we'd love to have you on camera. If you're a member of the public listening in or waiting to give public comment, we will have public comment at 3:40 p.m. today. We would ask that you leave your camera off unless you're a member or their proxy joining on their behalf. But would love to open this up to the floor, and I'll give people the opportunity to volunteer before I start volunteering you. But would love to hear, I don't think we're going to get into wordsmithing it today, but as the chair suggested, would love to start hearing from folks. What do you think are the essential components for inclusion in the mission, or the essential elements to address? Are there pieces of what you heard and see in front of you that feel right to you and are things that we should include? And again, a reminder to the members, you've got it in front of you if you're here in person. We've also emailed that copy of all mission drafts submitted to all members and members of the public. You'll find that online after today's meeting. But before I start calling on people who would like to volunteer their thoughts on what should be in that mission.
Oh,
We'll get rid of it.
that was not about mission.
Now, Representative Weissman, please.
Thanks. I guess I'll be that guy. I agree with what the chair said, that, a lot of words. I think there are fewer different concepts than there are sets of words. Personally, I would still want to stare at all of this more. And I had the thought of, if there's some copy pastable version of this, toss it into a tag cloud generator and, let some software do some of the surfacing of themes.
You're
for us.
suggesting that AI create our mission?
No. Emphatically no. We'll talk about AI policy later. But no, I've actually done that in the past. 2019, I'll spare the details. At any rate, I was trying in real time to pull out some common themes, conceding that the following is very incomplete and imperfect. Like, I came down to a common what and a common how. A common how, I think, insistence on, evidence-based approaches, obviously. Also, community or stakeholder engagement. Now, I think that those two words don't mean the same thing around here. They're both important. And I think that, that was captured pretty well in maybe the italicized version. I also wrote down for the what, the idea of both upstream and downstream focus. And I realized that when we state a mission, maybe as opposed to duties, there would be an even higher level, sort of more abstracted version of this. But upstream, meaning, how do we keep people from doing something that is criminal, legal in nature in the first place? See conversations about public health and structural determinants. And then downstream being recidivism reduction and sort of reentry support. I think those are both essential, and I think that those were spoken to in different ways in a lot of the different things that we all submitted by way of mission, and that was good to see. Anyway, as I was trying to track in real time, that's some of what popped out.
Thank you, Representative. I see
Yeah.
Adrian's hand up online.
Can I just do one follow-up question?
Adrian, just one
What-
second. We've got a follow-up question from Chair Kane.
So Rep. Weissman, when you talk about upstream, that's about prevention and those elements, because prevention was not listed at CCJJ. And, my memory is foggy, but now Chief Judge in Adams County, Don Quick, who had served on CCJJ as elected DA from Adams County, always said, I want to do more prevention. I want to do more prevention. And we never got, they never got to it. So I think that's really important that we capture that. Just a little historical comment there.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Adrian, online, if you want to come off mute.
Yes, and I would echo that, Madam Chair, and that's what went into my proposal for a mission statement, is that I think we have a real opportunity here to create something that is different than what existed before. And instead of focusing on what we have and tinkering with what we have, we need to build and create something better that does focus on prevention and the support mechanisms, so that we are impacting the amount of crime and the support systems to reduce recidivism and lower crime in the first place. So my suggestion was the one that says the mission should be to address the root causes of criminal behavior And I really think we have an opportunity here to use this committee to form alliances between and among state agencies, because often I think where we find ourselves is a little bit as islands in the stream, where we can focus on the things in front of us in terms of legislative approaches and what can we handle that's within our scope. But this committee gives an opportunity for somebody like DOC to partner with DHS or some other agency to say, listen, we're noticing that as people come into the system, they are really saying that part of what brought them here was a significant lack of XYZ, which really falls in your scope. Can we partner to look at, potentially legislation that would help in this area? And then on the flip side, right, on the outside, okay, we're hearing that as people come out, one of the things that's a real struggle is XYZ thing, and this falls in housing, or this falls under, HICPUF. How do we use this committee to help structure alliances in a meaningful way to provide both those preventative measures at the outset and those supportive measures at the end? And I think that's where we have a real opportunity here to change that focus and make this committee look different than what CCJJ did.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to give everybody a heads up. I'm going to take one more opportunity for people to volunteer. I think this is so important, even if your comments are to agree with others or to just address things that you've offered or specific elements of the mission. I do want to make sure we get everybody speaking. So I'm going to first start, and Victoria, I'm giving you I'm stalling to give people time to get their thoughts together. I'm going to go around the room, starting to my left with Victoria. I'll go around the room and then I'll go to our members online. If you're a proxy for somebody online, I will give you the option. I'm not going to put you on the spot, but would welcome you joining. But let me go to Victoria and then Director Stansel.
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I think there's a lot of overlap in what we have kind of commented through the missions. And it's nice to see. I think it's really well aligned with a lot of the testimony we've heard in our discussions. I really see key words that I think we should really build the mission out from in connecting and collaborating. Absolutely. I think we've heard that's really the purpose of this new reform entity on the larger scale, and thinking that we're really seemingly focusing on integrating on a much larger scale and in a formal way the community, and defining community in all the different ways that we're discussing and figuring out as we go. I think with that, under evidence-based approach, I think implementation and impact should also be key terms in our mission statement. Because if we're bringing the community in, right, as a reform entity, I would think that having an eye down, keep continuing downstream, right? Yeah, exactly. To what these reforms are actually doing in action will really, I think, get the essence of how we want to improve what's already been happening with CCJJ.
Thank you, Victoria. And thank you for letting me put you on the spot first.
No problem.
Director Stansel and then Debbie, please.
Victoria, I was going to try to jump in and save you, but you did a very good job. So I was going to try to go before you. But no, I agree with what everyone is saying. I think the key that we need to look at, though, is right now, there's a lot of looking at things in silos. Like I get a lot of calls about, well, what can the DOC do? Well, DOC is so far downstream. By the time they get to me, we can control what we can control and try to prepare for recidivism and try to prepare for them getting out. But by the time they arrive to us at the phase of the criminal justice system, we've missed a lot of opportunities to do things upstream that could have kept them from me or my department. So I think whatever we look at, and that's why I was the one that put in the holistic approach, we need to look at it from all aspects. We can't just single out corrections, or we can't single out the court system, because it's holistically, it all needs reform. So that's just a piece that I wanted to add. Don't know what it brought to the conversation, but that's just a piece that I wanted to add.
Thank you, Director. I'm going to go to Debbie and then Maureen and Rep. Weissman. I think we've heard from you, but tell me if you want to jump back in. I'll go to Debbie and then my intention is to go to Mr. Chavez.
So I looked at this a whole different way. I'm the one who put to oversee legislative changes. And my idea about that is not to look at everything, but to oversee the changes that are being made. And I really think that we have an opportunity to make something that is longstanding and in perpetuity by revamping the whole thing and throwing out what we had before and starting over. And I like a lot of the terminology about inclusivity and holistic and looking at the whole picture of from beginning to end, right? But by the time a child gets into education to the time they graduate and then what happens, and that whole thing needs to be changed. We need to eliminate as much as we can people's opportunities to go down the wrong path.
Thank you, Debbie. Mr. Chavez and then Emily.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I think I agree with so much of what's been said already, and I just want to highlight some things. Our goal is to transform, and I think that means to be innovative, implement fresh perspectives and be careful not to repeat the same format and mistakes that we've made in the past. We need to strengthen the weaknesses, and that's going to be I think the main goal is to make sure that we have a fresh approach. I also want to say that we need to include informed and evidence-based approach that's just keeps getting repeated. Public safety, crime prevention. I love the holistic word, the holistic approach, but it needs to be trauma informed, and mental health is huge. Reduce over reliance on incarceration, and it needs to implement education and alternatives, opportunities for these folks that are impacted and involved. And I know that a lot of this has already been said, but I feel like these are the key points that we need to hit. And that's all I have to say right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to continue along to Emily. I also want to, for those online, Senator Gonzalez has gotten out of the last meeting she was in and has arrived. Senator, we're just reviewing some of the member suggestions on missions and weighing in on some critical elements there. I'm not going to put you on the spot just yet. I am going around. I'm going to go to Emily, and then I'm going to go online to Tristan, and then Director Hilke. And Michaela, I know you're proxy, so I'll give you the option of being put on the spot or not. Emily, to you, though.
Sure, thank you. I really appreciate all the thoughts that are captured on the member input mission and much of what's been said here. And there's a lot of words that are popping out to me and resonating as we look at what actually goes into the mission, things like fair, just, compassionate, intentional, meaningful outreach. So we get that stakeholder feedback and input from everyone throughout Colorado that really has an important voice in any transformational legislative initiatives. Looking at the root causes, I really like the idea of looking at things that are preventative in nature in terms of reducing crime and reducing recidivism. Evidence-based practice feels like it needs to be a must in the mission to me. And holistic, I really like that word as well, but I would like to see that somewhat defined somewhere. One of the things that I see missing from all of the feedback is there's a lot about looking at the impact of victimization on crime victims, but there's nothing about victims' rights. And that often gets overlooked when we're talking about reform and what victims' role in the criminal legal system is and their rights as they engage or try to engage. So I would like to see some intention put around calling out that victims actually have a very important role and rights as in the criminal legal system.
Thank you. I'm going to go online now to Tristan, then Director Hilke, and Michaela. I'm going to take the camera on as an indication to go to you. So Tristan, I'll go to you and then the director.
Well, I agree with our chair that we need to keep in mind the task at hand is transformation. And I think that needs to be reflected in the mission, that the goal is transformation and new approaches as opposed to maintaining the status quo. I also agree with what Rep. Wiseman said about rather than simply focusing on what happens downstream or after a crime has happened, that it is critical we include something in the mission about what happens upstream. Crime prevention through evidence-based transformational reform is what I would like to see in the mission statement. I think that's the thing that would change the approach, transform it from a purely reactive, punitive approach, and actually try to look at root causes and reduce crime, reduce recidivism, and therefore reduce the number of victims that are being created.
Thank you, Tristan. Director Hilke, your thoughts on mission?
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. I think one of the things that we have to continue to do, I mean, I don't ever want to throw out the things that are some of the more basic things about public safety. That there were several examples in there about, public safety or acting in the interest of the community. I think those are some of the same things. I also think it's important that we continue to talk about, sorry about that, that we continue to talk about reducing the size of the world that we're dealing with, reducing incarceration, particularly of low and medium risk people that have the opportunity to self-correct and stay out of the system. Over treatment in the system causes people to stay in the system. We all know that. And then finally, how we cause people to re-enter. Now that is all, I get it, is midstream, downstream work. I do think that there should be a lot of upstream work. Whether or not upstream work should be done in the criminal justice system is debatable, right? Which they should be informed, but that's really where public health and health systems and behavioral health systems and human services systems almost need to have the upstream element of this in some ways. And so I continue to think about that. And the only other thought I wanted to share is that I liked Maureen's term of word salad. And I worry that we're gonna get lost in the word salad and the phrases used. It's easy for us to say we're gonna tear the system down or start over, but the practicality of that is that we're gonna have to make the system that we have better. And I have a difficult time understanding how we might be able to tear certain small parts of it down, but we can't just deconstruct it and start over. That I don't know how we would do that, and I don't know that we'd ever get any kind of consensus to do something like that. So I think trying to get at some specifics in these theoretical and philosophical ideas are going to be our challenge.
Thank you, Director. And you kind of foreshadowed what will be my next question to the group that I'll tee up. I'm going to go to Michaela and then come back into the room to Senator Gonzalez. My next question is going to be more around the intent, and Director Hilke kind of started going there. We've talked a lot about all of the words, and in the chair's word, the word salad. And Director Hilke highlighted the risk of it being too expansive. So my next question, after we hear from Michaela and the senator, will be, what should the mission be accomplishing? What level of specificity do you think it should be? Should it be the guiding vision, or should it really get more into the specific types of work that these entities are doing? What falls into duties? What falls into mission? So we'll come to that. I'm just teeing it up for you to think about for a minute. Michaela, your thoughts on what should be in the mission?
Sure. I truly don't think I can say it better than Tristan has already. Coming from the mental health lens, I just want to echo that I think working upstream would be our most powerful strategy. I think it would make a huge difference towards, our justice involved population, but also go towards making a much healthier Colorado. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. So Senator Gonzalez, and I know you were out being a senator when we started reading through all of these. Would just love your thoughts when you look at some of those missions that members have proposed. Are there things that stand out to you as this is the right direction, things to include, things that feel off, or where do you believe we should be going with what's in the mission itself?
Thank you. I'm grateful to be here with y'all today, and apologize for being tied up a little bit longer than I'd anticipated. But I'll just share that as I think about what the opportunity is in this new iteration, I do think that there is continued need for a forum for stakeholders to listen and hear each other. And I do want to also uplift the need for us to really be research and data driven and evidence based as we are contemplating what works and, quite frankly, what doesn't. So I'll leave it at that. I think that a space that provides a forum for dialogue for stakeholders from different parts of community or the system, and then also for us to be driven in evidence and facts, and not political whims or emotion.
Thank you, Senator. Now I'm going to open it up, and I'm not going to call people out. I'll leave it for people to volunteer. But I want to reflect some of what I'm hearing and reading. When I listened to everybody and read what everybody submitted, there were some very different approaches people were taking. Some were talking in their mission about what this entity should be striving to accomplish. Things like reducing recidivism or getting to that upstream. Some were naming in the mission how it would do it, by engaging stakeholders, by providing guidance to the legislature. Some were even naming how it would do it. Things like the use of data-informed practices and research. So I just want to share that back out. And then I would love people's thoughts, and this is going to sound a little complex, but what do you think the purpose of the mission is? Is it to define why these entities exist? Is it to define what they seek to accomplish? Is it to define how they are going to do that, or what their role is within it? And maybe your answer is all of those things. I would just ask everybody to think about, what do you want the mission that you lay out to mean for the future of this entity or entities? And where do we then get into the realm of duties? So I'll open it to the floor for thoughts on that, or just general reactions to what you've heard from your colleagues. And Madam Chair, I'll go to you first.
Thanks. I really liked Rep. Weissman's, the what and the how. I mean, there are two different lines here. And as we talk about, so I just have questions to people because I want to follow up on what Director Hilke said, which was, prevention does in many ways take us out of the criminal justice system, and the juvenile justice system. I've always said public safety is schools, healthcare, playgrounds, after school activities. That's what creates public safety, not necessarily, with all due respect, cops in cages, right? So, but I do worry about it. And when we talk root causes, it's root causes for that first delinquent act. It's root causes for that crime after you come out on parole. Root causes is very diverse. So when we get into prevention, we are going to cross over into other systems. And so I'm a little worried about it. I mean, I think it's important, and it might be more important as a duty for the juvenile group. Like, does the adult group address it in terms of recidivism, like reoffending, and how do we prevent reoffending? And does the juvenile group, You know, how do we stop entry into the justice system to begin with or whatever? And so I'm just a little scared about that. And I'm just wondering what people's thoughts are about that.
I'll open it to the floor for responses. Director?
Yeah, so when I hear what you're saying, I fully agree with you, because I think the approach that will be needed for someone that's returning to the community and what we're trying to do to help educate and prepare them to stay out in the community versus what we're having to do for those that have never entered the system is going to be two different messages and two different approaches. So I think, and to answer your question, I think the mission statement should cover why it exists, because I'm afraid if we start digging down, drilling down too much into how we want those entities to operate, then what you're saying, Ms. Kane, is going to get missed. Because if we give one mission statement for two different groups that have two totally different missions, then they're almost forced to create their own mission statement. And I know we're going to talk about that down the road, but I just think that there's two separate messages that's going to be sent to the two different groups.
Thank you, Director. Representative Weissman.
Thanks. Backing up to something Director Hilke said, I mean, in terms of upstream and downstream, I mean, no. I mean, we all have a, I mean, explain what I mean by no. We all have a sense of who the criminal legal system actors are. A lot of us are in the room here. To really broaden our frame of upstream and downstream, we are going very much outside of that usual set of actors. No disrespect. I do not want Director Stoncel to be in charge of childhood education or housing or occupational licensing certification of folks with priors. Yeah. In no way did I think that you did, but thank you for affirming. So even years ago, there was a reentry task force of CCJJ, and sometimes it would do things that were really about inside the system. What should sentencing structure look like? But you know, Chair Kane could speak to this, but if I think about these issues, and at some point the same things are going to be, I mean, we make our best effort upstream and it doesn't work and somebody's in the system and the director has them for a bit, but now the same things, education, jobs, housing, mental health, substances, are part of the downstream non-recidivation question. I don't think cognizance of that in this context means, all right, all of a sudden, you know, DOC has a $15 billion budget and they're doing all the things. Nobody is saying that, but I will say that anyway. Rather, that going forward, there just has to be a lot more awareness and effort to sort of pull in the expertise of other state entities, and depending on the group that gets set up down the road on a project basis, you know, community organizations and other sources of expertise. Example, even with the reentry task force, did we ever talk to DOLA about the investments in supportive housing? Did we ever talk to DORA about what's the, and there was a little bit of work on this done in 18 out of the RETF, I carried those bills. You know, we have to look at occupational licensing. What do we know outside of licensed professions about the willingness of anybody out there in the occupational space to look past people with priors? How can we be aware of that kind of thing? You know, what do childhood development specialists ever come and tell us to inform juvenile justice conversations? Have they even been invited? That's the kind of thing that that I think we all mean by that. And I appreciate the point that Director Hilke made. Anyway, back to the mission. I think I agree with Director Hilke on this point too. I'm not personally big on laboring too much over the words. But a shared understanding is important. It's more important than the words, but the thing is, people are going to come and go. And then you do want to have some direction as folks come in down the road. And the purpose of writing down a mission or a vision or a set of duties is that's one of the first places that people will look to. Mr. Abramson, appreciate how you sort of you pointed out that people had very different lenses on this. Is the mission about the what? Is the mission about the how? Is the mission about the who? I don't think it's any one of those things for myself, but I'll stop there.
I appreciate that. I'm going to continue to keep it open to the room, and I'm going to go to Emily next. I also don't want to skip past Director Stansel's pointer question, so I would invite people to weigh in on, can we have a single mission? That is, whether it's the umbrella coordinating council, and then are there submissions, or are these fundamentally unique missions for the two entities? So would invite commentary on that and additional thoughts on what this mission should accomplish. Emily, to you.
Thanks. As someone who's spent their entire career in nonprofit work, I've certainly done a ton of work on missions in various different organizations. And typically when we're talking about what is a mission, it really describes the purpose and the container for the work that is going to be done, so that there's not mission drift. You'll hear people talk about that in the nonprofit world a lot. But I think that it doesn't need to be long. It can be a simple statement, but it needs to be that container for the work that's been done. So it also allows access for people to come in and out of that group and know what their role is and what their purpose is there. So I keep coming back to, it should define the purpose of the entity or entities. And then, there's things to define tasks and duties that can come through things like what guides the practice, like value statements, that it's evidence-based that we're looking at, or vision statements is really what is the change we're trying to make when we do our work? How do we know we're achieving it? Those kinds of things. So I realize that's a little bit rambly, but I think I'm working from maybe a different framework when I'm thinking about mission as we define it here, that kind of pulls us out of a discussion around, do we talk about prevention in the criminal legal system, or do we talk about prevention before someone's in the criminal legal system? Those types of things.
Thank you. And I want to transparently talk about the process of getting a mission drafted. We don't have the next 12 months. We don't have the next 12 weeks. So I think realistically, what we're going to be looking at is your chairs are going to take all of your input and assemble some drafts for people to respond to. So given that, I want to again open it to the floor for input on it. But I also, Madam Chair, want to look to you if you have specific questions to help inform it as you and Mr. Raines go forward to draft something.
Right. And this is really helpful. And I agree with Emily. I think that the mission statement should be the purpose, and kind of simple and all encompassing. And so, a lot of places have mission statements, vision statements, blah, 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 a lot of stuff. And it's really hard to put everything in a mission statement. And that's why when we started this conversation, it was like, we have to take duties or specific themes out of the mission and make it broad. Because I like everyone's comments, Victoria's and Andre's, about, because I think that, as we pick out words, some of them will fit nicely into a mission. I'm just gonna be honest, evidence bases all over the place. And sometimes it's, as Matt knows, it's evidence it's not always evidence based. It's, there's different levels of, evidence informed. What are all the terms?
Yeah, promising practices.
Promising.
Yeah, I mean, I think if it's okay,
Yeah.
I think it's important to keep that in mind and finding ways to support those promising practices and things that are evidence informed, because a lot of what people today are really excited about, and there's some promise to it, it's not what I would consider evidence based. And so we need to be mindful of that and not be too narrow in how we describe this sometimes. And I think setting a mission statement that provides for a broad enough vision that adapts with time, but still points us to a North Star is a way that we can kind of address that. So sorry, as the non-voting member.
I've got Director Hilke online, and then I'll come into the room for Rep. Weissman. Director.
Yeah, thanks. I think I'm just going to foot stomp what Matt Lund just said. I do think that we can't box ourselves into just evidence-based. Evidence-informed and promising practices are things that need to be considered. when I worked with the National Institute of Corrections on a evidence-based decision-making concept, I once implemented a policy in the sheriff's office with patrol people that was a promising practice. Was not evidence-based, but it started to transform the culture of patrol people in starting to think and assess the risk of people and whether or not, were they risky enough to incarcerate or were they not risky enough? You could simply give them a warning or maybe release them on a summons. And it transformed our patrol division, but it was not an evidence-based practice. It was a promising practice. And I think we miss the opportunity to do some good work if we don't consider exploring some of those things.
Thank you, Director. Rep. Weissman, and then I'm probably going to move to wrap this up unless other folks have important comments to add.
Thank you. I appreciate those points from directors, and Professor Terranova might have things to add here too. I wanted to pull something back from a conversation I had with people at CoLab. This was a few weeks ago now that I might have referred to here previously. Truly don't mean to split hairs. I actually think that this is important, whether we point at promising or evidence-informed or evidence-based. We have to first decide what we mean by evidence. And to me, we're awash in data. Our society is very good at generating it. Data is another word for a momentary phenomenon. Evidence is data situated within a theoretical construct or framework. Now, the problem is that's where the debate gets interesting. What is our theoretical construct or framework about? Well, okay, I mean, broadly speaking, we're talking about changing behavior here. I think upstream and in the director's institutions and downstream. To make a grossly generalized statement, we don't want people to do certain things. We don't want people to do things that are defined as violations of the law and are hurtful to other human beings or property. That may involve correcting. So we can start to develop theoretical frameworks toward that. The less certain is our theoretical framework, the less squarely is data or some set of phenomena going to be able to be situated in that framework and held up as evidence. That's wonky stuff. I'll stop there, but and I don't think that's the stuff of the mission regardless. That's the stuff of a little bit downstream. But when we talk about X, Y, Z, or is not evidence-based, informed, whatever, let's not skip over that there's a key definition there about what evidence is in the first place.
And I think that probably is, please, Ms. Underholder.
Thank you. The mission statement should be shorter than what I wrote and what a lot of us wrote, and very broad. I like what Emily said about that. And the only mission statement, because the subcommittees are already going to be separated. We need to make sure that there aren't silos, and having separate mission statements for the working groups would create more silos, and that leads to not best practices.
So that's why I would actually like to go into duties next, so that I can understand as we write this, like if we're doing a broad, simple, 10,000-foot mission statement, everybody is concerned about reentry, prevention, which I see more as, maybe duties or objectives. Maybe objective is better than duties. It's like to study, prevention and interventions, to keep kids from being in the school to prison pipeline, and maybe those are duties. Say you create different groups in statute, but then the mission statement's up here, but each of the groups might have some statutory duties. And that's a prevention kind of thing. And whether we want to be so specific or not, we can talk about, but that's kind of what I think you're saying, but we might be able to put something about each group in statute. So there's that communication. 'Cause you'll all know what each one is kind of sort of working on, right?
So I'm going to go to Ms. Terranova, and then I'm going to give us a little bit of a segue to, I think, move into duties, which will then flow into structure. Ms. Terranova.
Sure, thank you. I just wanted to kind of build a bit on our evidence-based informed discussion, maybe throw out some more key terms. So yeah, like empirically in the literature, what evidence-based practices are is like a wide range, right? Is it you have data and you've tested it once? Is it a study? Is it replicated studies over and over again that are showing that this is an effective practice? Like there's a range. So I think evidence-informed, maybe thinking to building out using terms that would age well. Evidence informed may be a consideration. I agree. I think best practices is a common term referring to a lot of what Director Hilke was addressing. And then also, I think bringing in the community, meeting community needs would be a nice way to comprehensively round out those other like angles of looking at reform. So, what we know in the science, whether that's based on theory or on study, right? What we know in practice, what works, whether it's been tested or not. And then, this reform entity is creating reforms that are based on what we know the community in Colorado needs. That seems to, I don't know, could be.
Thank you.
You're right. I think we should go to structure before we go to duties, because structure may be a foregone conclusion. I don't know.
I think that's right. And I did just want to pick up on something, and I know you weren't going there, but you mentioned stakeholders and community. When I gave the overview of the meeting, I didn't mention, you'll see on your agenda, our final topic today is a discussion of the role of community and key stakeholders in this whole work. So what we're going to do, it's 1:17. We're going to take a brief break, which I'm going to continue to provide for everybody to stretch their legs or do as you need. Let's reconvene, though, sharply at 1:25. And we'll go into a discussion of structure followed by duties. Back in session. We are now going to continue our discussion, moving into structure. And I don't have slides, I don't have data or handouts for this one. This one is really going to be a personal conversation among members. Just to ground us back in where we last spoke about this, and just reflecting what we've heard and captured from everybody. I don't want to say that there was unanimous agreement on something. What I will say is, as we recorded or reviewed the recordings and everybody's notes and submissions, there was a general consensus that the work addressing criminal justice and juvenile justice required different expertise, probably required some different membership that was unique to those needs. There was a broadly supported, but certainly I don't think we got anywhere near unanimity because we weren't going for that there should be some type of body that was an umbrella. And we used terms like a coordinating council across two entities. There was some unanswered questions of how decisions would be made. For example, if a juvenile justice entity made recommendations, what would be the role of their membership, the role of the adult criminal justice entity, and the role of the coordinating council in taking votes on any of those. But I think that's where we left off. What was a broad belief that the needs of each criminal justice and juvenile justice were unique and may call for unique membership. We didn't yet get into the actual structure, though. So I think that's where we're going to go. And I'm going to ask our chair to kick us off with her thoughts and reflections of where we are and questions that you'd like the group to entertain here.
Well, there will be a lot of questions around this. And if we do two different groups, we'll have to talk about membership on both of them. And if we go with an oversight or a coordinating council, whether that group has the ability to shut down any recommendations from each group. I think that was the core issue, or whether they are really truly coordinators that make sure that the topics are shared, that they overlap. And we can talk about membership, but it's just kind of a smaller management, again, coordination group that's not voting on recommended policies. And so I want people's thoughts on that. Because I think that may end up being, Jason was the only one that was pretty strong in keeping two different groups. But, and Tom was saying, I think we need coordination, but I think he said out loud, I don't know that they need to be voting. They just need to be serving that kind of function. And, you know, some of those people will serve on various groups and make sure that they let the council know what's happening on the juvenile side or happening on the adult side. That's what I was thinking where we were. So, but, you know, I open it up to discussion.
Why don't we do this? This is one of those places where I am going to call on everybody. And what I'm going to do to start off the conversation is ask for a 90-second lightning round. Just where your current thinking is. I think it's important for the members to hear from one another. What your current thinking is. Is it two distinct entities? Is it two arms of one entity? Or where are you as kind of a baseline? And then let's use that as a lightning round, and then we'll go into the questions or things that you think in particular are important. And Ms. Terranova, again, you get to go first, followed by Director Stansel.
That's good. Thank you. I think two entities, or I'm sorry, two arms of one entity. You know, there are definitely adult and juvenile specific issues in the system requiring wildly different expertise, but there's also overlap. And I think, you know, in some of the testimony I heard and in discussions and just general understanding of things, we know that there's overlap in transition from the juvenile to the adult system. There's overlap in regards to juveniles that interact with the juvenile justice system, and then what that means for their interaction with the adult system. Resourcing obviously is different. The goals of the systems are different, but I think there needs to be a structured effort at avoiding silos in that and having the two arms. Now, how that flows up the hierarchy into one larger overseeing body, I think that requires individuals from both camps equally represented.
Director Stansel, with the exception of apparently cooking and early childhood that we know we're not going to get into. What are your thoughts?
No, I would agree. It would be two arms of the same entity, but I also like the idea of that overall the umbrella entity not being able to shut down what the two arms developed. Because if they're putting in all the work and they're doing all the research and all that for an oversight group that really wasn't involved in all of the sandwich making, if you will, to say, no, we're not going to sell those sandwiches, I don't think that's a good idea.
Thank you. Ms. Hunter-Holan.
I agree that there should be an oversight or a whatever you call it, committee that doesn't have a voting right, but has the ability to help the other entities. And I will say that because I think there will be times when you may only need one or you may need three subcommittees or five, depending on what you're studying or what is brought before the major group. Anyway, that they help facilitate and move things so that nothing is left. You don't leave anything drop, and that their job is to oversee all of that, all the moving pieces, and help move things along.
Thank you. Chair Kane and then Senator Gonzalez.
I think last meeting we talked about a unicorn a lot. And I think that was about this, because if you look at all the states we looked at, they usually have a juvenile and adult. You know, that's kind of the more common structure. But, you know, I'm okay with the not an override power unicorn, you know, coordinating. And, you know, of course, I'm always sadly like going far ahead, thinking that group could also have the responsibility of shepherding through, you know, the legislative process or the implementation process of certain policy recommendations in departments or whatever. It could also be the group that does the the accountability kind of thing that was in the statute of CCJJ, but we never got to do, like the thing that Victoria talked about. So anyway, so I'm okay with the coordinating council.
Senator and then Representative.
As I am listening to y'all's comments, I keep thinking of sort of a triangle, right? Where there's a coordinating council and then two entities. And instead of that, I'd like to just submit for consideration the idea of like a dumbbell. Trying to think of like, right, like something that is like, that's got two sides on it, but that is actually connected so that there isn't, so that the people who make up adult and juvenile also make up the coordinating, if that makes sense, as opposed to a subset of one, a subset of another. And I say that because if we continue to say that each of these perspectives is so important and each of these voices matters in these conversations, I would want to ensure that they are reflected in that overarching council. Is I guess the thing that I would like to submit.
Senator, and just for clarification, because I may fall under dumbbell, I want to make sure that I'm hearing clearly. Is your vision then that there would be hypothetically, 11 members of a criminal justice, 11 members of a juvenile justice, and 4 members of each of those would comprise? Who would comprise?
That to me is what a triangle would be.
Okay.
To me, like where there's a subset that then goes and
You're talking totally
And I'm
unique
saying,
membership.
yeah, if there's 11 and 11, then it's the 22, assuming that the members who serve, that there are not members who don't serve on both, right? So if there were to be members who serve on both, that's fine, right? Like we understand and recognize that there's a lot of overlap within systems.
So no coordinating council members who are not members of one of the entities.
Thank
Thank you for letting me clarify that. Chair Kane.
Yeah, and I just want to follow up with that with Senator because and just how this works. So then if there's 11 and 11 and they're 22, do the 22 people vote on what the juveniles do and what the adults do? So because, you know, we need education for sure in the juveniles and schools and everything, maybe not necessarily in the adult side. You may want community colleges over there or something. But so that's what we had now, that those school people didn't know how to vote on the adult stuff, right? So I don't know. So how does that look?
In the way that I appreciate the question, in the way that I would, as I'm just hearing folks talk about these ideas, I respect what the decision-making entities who have that subject matter expertise, it is inform and share, not ask for permission to vote, if that makes sense. Like, so if the juvenile, assuming we're making the two distinctions of bucket A and bucket B to be adult and juvenile, right?
Right.
If that is the case, then if the adult entity makes a decision, they inform and educate or share or what have you, but there's no then additional step in the way that I'm contemplating this. Or
Right.
there's not another vote.
All right. So they vote. And when they meet for between the dumbbells, you know, whatever that's called, the rod or whatever, that when they're doing that, it's an informational.
If that to me is what coordination would look like, as opposed to having to then report to somebody else, ask for another vote. I think that was some of the, there was tension within the CCJJ around having to then go from a task force to then the full CCJJ and then have those votes take place.
But I think what people were saying, this up there, coordinating council is a non-voting group. So in the triangle, they are non-voting. Okay.
Thank you. Rep. Weissman and then Mr. Chavez.
So we're talking about structure, but I can't think about structure without answering the question, what functions is the structure supposed to address? So now I think back to, you know, everything we've been hearing. which is we don't want one or even two groups permanently sitting over all of the things that there are to grapple with. We understand that whether in response to community demands or emergent needs or frankly, policy trends nationwide, we'll study this thing one year, that thing the next year, and different groups of people will be convened in response to those needs. So a question I've been turning over or trying to turn over in my head for a meeting or two now is convened by whom? Somebody has to bring that thing into being. And I think that is one of the major, frankly, should be one of the few functions of, just call it a coordinating structure or structures. If we're gonna, I'll just make up something. Juvenile reentry. Who we want to get a bunch of people together to grapple with that. Who is going to get them together? Somebody has to be the decider of that question. That is one of the things that a coordinating structure would do. And then that group will go and do its thing and hold meetings and solicit testimony and review research and maybe not write up legislation. I'm kind of moving away from writing up legislation, frankly, but write up findings, certainly. But then, you know, their charge was limited in time and scope, and these are all people volunteering their time. So who is then there when that group is done and they go back to the field like Cincinnatus? Well, again, coordinating structure. Somebody has to be there liaising with the legislature and executive branches and making sure the website is updated and sort of ministerial things. With all that said, what I don't think is right is adult, juvenile, superstructure on top of that, bunch of work groups under here. Too much structure. I don't want that. So I think one of two things makes sense. We acknowledge, I think there's a broad shared understanding here, adult and juvenile are different. The right one coordinating group could still be in charge of instantiating time-limited issue-specific groups on both if they're very clear as to they really have to get those differences right. And you don't get the same people together in the juvenile group next year as you did the adult group last year. So then you have one and sort of, again, time-limited issue-specific task forces. Or, you know, you have two and they have to talk to each other. Is that a barbell or dumbbell maybe? But you don't have like a 3-level pancake stack. That's too many pancakes. I don't know if any of that made sense, but that's where I'm at right now.
So I just have a follow-up question to what you're talking about, Representative Weissman. Well, from what I heard, you were assuming that this coordinating council was going to make decisions about what working groups were in the juvenile area and the adult area. I was assuming that the decision on what working groups and what issues, you know, juvenile group with 12 people decides the issue that we really want to do is reentry, and reentry for juveniles is different than reentry of adults. They go back to school, you know, I mean, the adults usually not, you know, so they have that group, but that juvenile group makes the decision of what their working groups or task forces look like, not the coordinating council. That's just there to share information. That's what I understood we were talking about. And I think you were assuming they were going to make a decision about what policies were going to be addressed within the group.
Thanks for the chance to clarify. Somebody has to be in charge of scoping the specific work groups. And yeah, maybe I did supply an assumption there. If we are going to have adult group, juvenile group, and those groups are going to do exactly what you just said, be the carefully
The decision makers for what
go
the studies are.
yeah. Then I don't know if we need a coordinating council. Frankly, you have one or two people on each of juvenile and adult charged to liaise with the other. And I think we could maybe spare a little bit of structure and even confusion and risk of mission creep that might flow from that additional bit of formal structure.
Thank you, Rep. Weissman. I'm going to go to Mr. Chavez and then over to Emily, and then we'll go online. Just listening to everybody, I'm going to try to detangle things a little bit because I think we're talking about a couple of unique issues. One is the fundamental structure. If we were drawing a chart of this, where do people sit who are working on juvenile justice? We also have the issue that we just heard among Rep. Weissman and Chair Kane about who then is deciding what work they are doing. We have a third issue of how, if we have these two bodies, they communicate. So I'm going to try to push people to address each of those in the unique aspects of them of, do we have one common membership addressing adult and juvenile justice, or do we have two separate bodies? Then we have the question of, is there a triangle, as Senator Gonzalez said, or do we have the members of those two all working together? We have the separate question that I might suggest comes as we talk about more operational and duties things of how they decide what issues to work on. I'm going to push us to really drill into what is the fundamental structure. Ms. Kane, does that feel right to you?
Right. I don't think we should, I think we can decide that they decide what they work on. How they decide what they work on is a different question. And I think, as I would say, above the line or below the line, that's a below the line, that the group will work out, whether it's through, CCJJ, and Stan remembers this, sometimes we'd have retreats where, there'd be major discussion about what the policy priorities were going to be.
Yep.
And I don't know that we want to get into those weeds. So I agree.
I'm going to go all the way back to middle school and ask, are we doing a Venn diagram? Do we have two circles? Do they intersect? Is there a line between them? Is there a box up above them? And how do they interact? Ubaldo and then Emily. And then I'll go online to Tristan, Director Hilke, and Michaela.
I'd like to start to say that I'm excited to hear that it sounds like most of us are in agreement about not having a governing body, and that excites me. And so I really agree with what Senator Gonzalez said about 3 tiers of coordinating council who can really, that coordinating council can really help with like meeting setup, locations, and then have that, the language set, and then get perspective from the 2 distinct pillars. And so I agree that there's distinctions between juvenile and adult for sure, but I really like the idea of nothing overarching, but something in between. So I agree with that. And then I feel like that coordinating council does not have voting power. No way can it shut anything down. And the other thing that came to mind is I don't want us to be afraid of the number. I know Senator Gonzalez threw out 11. I think that's too small. I don't know if that was just an obscure digit that she threw out, but I feel like that coordinating council can be large because we need representation from numerous sources, a lot of expertise. And I know that maybe meetings can carry on too long when there's such a large group, but I feel like, if we were around 20, 21 to keep an odd number in each pillar, I don't feel like, that coordinating council of 40 members is too big, because I feel like there's so many aspects and perspectives that need to be heard. And I'm probably going to get some pushback on that because it is probably important that we get the right number, but I think that's all I have to say.
Thank you very much. We go to Emily, and then we're going to bring in our online members.
Great, thank you. I think I definitely agree and I'm encouraged by the discussion that there needs to be one group for juvenile issues and one for criminal legal issues. I think that's in my opinion, the right way to go because the issues are so different, even though there is overlap. In terms of a coordinating council, I do believe they should be a non-voting entity, whatever that looks like. Because I think one of the big things that has happened before is that really good work happens at the task force level or, from the experts, and then it doesn't filter up. That's one of the big things we heard from public testimony. That's one thing I personally saw in the CCJJ that was highly problematic, and you lose a lot of the importance of the discussion and the nuance that comes from that. So I do think someone has to coordinate, or something has to coordinate and facilitate and make sure things are moving forward and don't get stagnant, and that there is that drive. Whether that's a dumbbell or a triangle or a unicorn, I'm not really sure. But I think ultimately what matters most is that it's a non-voting, that it keeps things facilitated and moving forward, and that those are two distinct groups doing the work.
Thank you. And not to overcomplicate it, there were some notes in some of the comments, and I'll just leave this for all of you to contemplate. In listening to all of you about the desire to have or not have this peak of the triangle or this other body, there's certainly going to be conversations when we talk about where this is housed and how it operates and the duties of whether you use staff for any of that role of liaising between them. So I'll just leave that out there. I want to go to Tristan and then Director Hilke and then Michaela online for what has definitely not turned out to be the lightning round thoughts. Let's get your full thoughts on should we be having 1, 2, and what should be between them. Tristan, to you first.
So I definitely agree that it's important to have two separate groups, one for adult criminal legal system and one for the juvenile system, for all the reasons that have already been stated. I'm not fully convinced that we need a coordinating council or something in the middle, but to the extent that that is going to happen, I wholeheartedly agree that that should not be a voting body. That should not be another layer of approval in between where the ideas from the experts in either adult or juvenile are coming from, and those ideas getting to policymakers. I don't want to see us repeating some of the same mistakes from CCJJ. And I certainly agree with what's already been said as far as there was tension there because of the extra layer of approval. So wouldn't want to see that happen again.
Thank you, Tristan. Director Hilke, your thoughts on the entity structure.
Yeah, I think the fact that we have two arms, one in the adult criminal world and one in the juvenile world, is sort of a foregone conclusion. It seems like that is the one thing that we all seem to be coalesced on. Whether it's an overarching group or a group in the middle, I probably don't have a strong opinion either way. However, I'm going to play a little bit of the heretic here. Not everything about the CCJJ was wrong or done wrong. I think one of the powers of CCJJ was presenting a recommendation to the General Assembly that demonstrated the power of consensus or the strength of consensus as it came to them as an idea. And if it's been my experience that legislators very much appreciated knowing that there was, a very powerful consensus on an issue, or whether it was fractured and it was split. And so I get the piece about not having a vote to override an idea that comes from one of the groups, but there ought to be, and I don't have the answer for this, and this is something that could be hashed out, but I do think there should be some sort of a tabulation of the strength of the votes of the groups. If you're a legislator, and I'm going to try to channel my best legislator through the expert people that are up there in the room. If a recommendation comes to the body that has a powerful consensus in a juvenile group and powerful consensus of endorsement in the adult group and powerful consensus from an oversight group, that's a pretty strong opinion to present to the General Assembly that I think will carry more weight than something that comes that's quite fractured. And so without a voting mechanism of some kind, maybe it's a voting mechanism that doesn't override, you're not going to be able to show the power of the consensus within the groups or various groups. And so I do think that before we completely abandon that idea, let's not forget that piece.
Thank you, Director Hilke. Michaela.
I'm not sure how much I have to add on this exactly. I do think there should be some dialogue between the criminal justice group and the juvenile justice group, partially just because I think the lived experience of that can be quite fuzzy. So yeah, I think that's all I have. Also, I apologize if you can hear my dog in the background.
That's quite all right. In Colorado, I don't think any of us have to apologize for our dogs. I'm willing to, we have anywhere between 2 and 10 minutes for this. And that's to say we can wrap, we can continue some discussion. We are going to move it into duties. I think as with mission, this is going to fall on your chairs to ingest all of this input and bring back a proposal. But before just wrapping this conversation, I do want to open it to the floor because we've heard very different perspectives from folks, from strong advocacy for a coordinating council to pretty adamant belief that we should not have one. And I'd love to hear from folks as you've heard from your peers or colleagues. Were you swayed? Did it alter? Where are you thinking as we head out? I won't do a roll call on this, but I'll open it to the floor if anybody would like to weigh in of where you sit right now, having heard your peers.
So I just have one question. If we don't develop some sort of oversight, whatever we want to call it, what happens when you have that committee that there is no consensus? So how does that voice get heard? So if you have a chairman that is not agreeing with, if it's split 50-50 or whatever, and not agreeing to listen or to do the will of that body, who then steps in to make sure that voice is heard? And I know the oversight committee, the way I'm picturing it, is not a voting member. But if you have, let's say you have 15 people in that group and 7 of them have concerns about the way the group is operating, who do they share their concerns with? If you have the adult side and the juvenile side, if I'm on the adult side and I have concerns about the way this entity is operating, who do I talk to? If there's no oversight committee, and I hate the term oversight committee because it seems like we're supervising that committee. We're not supervising that committee, but it's just a level for someone to voice concerns about how, if they have concerns about that committee. I just want to pose that question.
No, thank you, Director. I'm going to go to the center of the room to Madam Chair and to our 2 legislators, and particularly Senator Gonzalez, since you had floated some of this. Would welcome any of you weighing in on how does something get what is not the oversight, but the coordination when there's dissent or different issues like that.
Yeah, we're all drawing things.
I got the sense, it was funny as we left the office, I told Carrie, it's weird for me to go to a meeting without all of my whiteboards and chart papers, and it turns out I should have brought them today.
I have a thing, and I'm sorry. I have a thing, and I'm sorry to the folks online. But basically, what Maureen and I are talking about are 2 very similar ideas that are slightly different. So to Director Hilke, to your perspective about there being a power in having a policy that achieves consensus. I think that if there is to be this continued idea of an adult space and a juvenile space, and if they achieve consensus in those spaces respectively, that will carry forward that power to those of us in the legislature. My little picture here is, if there is to be coordination, it is by both members who create the adult and then members who do the juvenile. In each entity, like the juvenile would go and figure out what their work is and if it's 2, if it's 10, if it's 3, whatever, they would figure that stuff out and they would have that decision-making power. They'd only come together as the two halves of my little circle here in order to share and coordinate and inform, and not to vote on, like, juvenile doesn't get to vote on adult stuff, adult doesn't get to, like, that doesn't happen. Marine's picture is a little different.
And Senator Gonzalez's picture is much better than mine, but mine's just a classic Venn diagram. There's the adult and the juvenile, they overlap. Those overlap is the coordinating people. So you have 21 people over here on the juvenile and 21, but there's 3 of those and 3 of those will operate in a coordinating council. Because I do think there needs to be, I'm thinking about on the victim issue. And the adults are talking about victim right. Well, we better get some input about juvenile victims and parental rights from the juvenile side. Because, I'm working on a bill right now about restorative justice with a couple representatives. And, do parents have to agree to this, and I'm in my world, I'm thinking one thing, other people in the juvenile world are thinking something else. So, so if you don't have that overlap, like this is what we're working on, this is what we're doing, and the juvenile people say, whoa, wait a minute, you can't have a kid consent without parents, or you can have can the court override parental consent, blah, blah, blah. So then, they better crosstalk on that. So that's why I went to that kind of thing. So it's not totally a triangle. It's not totally a dumbbell. It's not even a unicorn, but so anyway. Emily.
Emily, please.
Just a clarifying question. I think some of that cross conversation almost matters what membership then looks like, because I would like to presume there would be some kind of victim representation on both committees. And so you might not need as much coordination as you just described, because you would have that expert at the table in the conversation from the start.
Yeah.
And other experts too. I know victims are my issue, but.
Thanks.
Thanks. I think the concerns the chair just raised are most important to be addressed at the task force level. Taking it up, and I think I didn't draw a picture because my pictures are worse than my words, as bad as those seem to have been this afternoon. This largely captures, I think, where I'm at. Fair point. We can talk about the numbers. We always drive toward an odd number for voting. But really, the adult half and the juvenile half will be voting insofar as how we're going to frame up this task force. And then that's almost it. The two halves are never going to act together. So let's just take 15 and 15, 30. It's an even number, but so what? As to how they keep apprised of each other, frankly, they talk. All right, so I chair the Judiciary Committee, and I don't know, Rep. Snyder chairs the Finance Committee. There might be overlap. I walk across the floor and talk to them, or our vice chairs talk to each other. To Director Hilke's point about sort of what messages are sent out of whatever happens here to the legislature. Look, legislators sort of do look for signaling as we are assessing policies and making up our minds. I'll use another legislative analogy. All right, so the Agriculture Committee in the House is 13 members. That is not an issue space I know a ton about. So as I'm figuring out how to vote on something that comes out of the Agriculture Committee to the floor, all right, I'm going to read the bill, look at the fiscal note, whatever else. If it's 13-0, that says one thing. And if it's, 7-6, that says another thing. And right now, 7-6 means it was not just party line. And then I'm going to look at how the 7-6 went. And maybe both parties were split, and there's some interesting fracture going on that doesn't abide by the usual lines. So I think, any legislator who's putting in a tiny bit of effort is going to assess whatever comes out of these sorts of work groups in a similar way. All right, who was on there and they represent what interests, and the vote sheet says this. Information will be gleaned even through sort of one level of voting, as it were. Yeah, there was that multi-step funneling process at CCJJ on the one hand that arguably that did transmit more information to the legislature. I think it was also a source of a great deal of the frustration about the former entity by the end of its time.
So I just have one question on your diagram. Why are they in one circle? That would indicate that they have some shared identity in that circle. And I don't, is it called? Is that circle called something? Or do we just really have two circles? And then this follow-up question to Rep. Weissman, you and Rep. Snyder are on the floor together every day. You have a space to talk and to communicate. These are people that are coming from all over the state and all over. And so don't always have the space to communicate. And unless you give them some structure around communication, it may not happen. You have in this building structure around communication because you have a shared space. So
I'm going to ask Rep. Weissman to respond, and then I do want to, Debbie over here is looking to get in. Rep. Weissman, do you want to address that first?
Yeah, look, it's a fair point. Almost by definition, I mean, these things aren't happening in this environment the same way. Whatever date gets selected upon for, these entities to spring into being after appointment processes, and we're going to need to grapple with that downstream of where we are. There's going to need to be a getting to know you function. Maybe somebody is out of Grand Junction and somebody else is out of Greeley. All right, that's a couple hours of drive time there. But phone, Zoom, etc. Is that the same as in person? No, I'm old-fashioned enough to say not. But people need to have each other's contact information, and especially up front, and as new members come in over time, there will need to be a rapport building process and a trust building process so that people feel free to have candid conversations with each other, even if not in a shared physical space, about things that really matter.
Thank you, Rep. Weissman. Ms. Hunter-Holen, and then Debbie, after you, I am going to try to bring us back together and move us on to duties, but would want to give you as much time as you'd like.
So I'm concerned about that picture because I don't see non-legislative issues being addressed. I don't see community coming in. I don't see the prevention of silos or the prevention of communication. All I see is this group doing this and this group doing this and doing the same thing that was done in CCJJ. It's not different. I don't see it being different. Our job is to transform. And then how does that diagram go on forever? I mean, this committee is supposed to be in perpetuity or whatever the word was. Permanent. That doesn't allow for that.
It's in the executive.
Thank you, Ms. Hunter-Holen. Ms. Terranova.
Wants to respond. I don't know. I think this discussion's really interesting because it is really kind of the meat, right? Or like the transmission of this whole reason we're here. I agree that there's a legitimacy, I don't want to say legitimacy, but I'll use the term, to having it being an oversight and having the vote and all of that. But I think what the vote, it sounds like may have represented was a vetting of the reforms and the mandates. And I can see the need for having a structured formal committee that brings these two entities together, absent of the voting criteria, which sounds like, and we heard from the testimony and in our discussions, may have been perceived as a hurdle in some circumstances and instances. Maybe seeing this oversight committee as more of an advising committee that has come together to do several things. A, coordinate the collaborating subcommittees, right? To be the entity in the middle to say, Subcommittee A, you should talk to Subcommittee B because this issue you're examining overlaps. But also to serve as setting some criteria for the reforms, the mandates that are coming out of the task forces to evaluate what they're doing. So an advising committee that would be in charge of saying, okay, you put this together, where have you examined inequality and its impact? Okay, you put this together, where's the evidence-informed criteria? What about implementation? And having some, and what those components are, obviously, will be decided much later on. But having that committee in charge of setting that criteria, which still allows for the vetting, but doesn't necessarily enable it to stand as a hurdle for a task force to say, well, we've looked at some of these things, maybe it doesn't check all of these boxes or marks, but we still want to move forward with trying to get the legislation passed and so on and so forth. Kind of bringing down that wall, but still leaving all the benefits of having an entity there that can really, that is an expert in the subcommittees, so to speak, and what they're doing.
So, Madam Chair,
Yeah, I think well, I want Senator Gonzalez to talk, but what I was thinking about that Tom and I might do is I hear three things. You know, I see kind of the Venn diagram, I see kind of this diagram, and I see the triangle with different ideas about it. And maybe we'll put together three concepts and then further discuss and vote, you know, as we get ready for voting.
I think that makes sense. And Senator Gonzalez, I want to bring you in. What I'm hearing from people is a distinction in the difference in views of membership and of voting and decision making. But
No, thank you. The way that I contemplate this is rooted in my experience being a co-chair of a caucus that spans both chambers. I often joke that I know nothing about how the House works because I really don't. And yes, we are all legislators, but the experiences and the customs and the dynamics within the House are actually quite different and, to me, weird as a senator. And outsiders wouldn't necessarily recognize that. They would say, well, you're all legislators, don't you all see each other every day? And in a lot of ways we don't. And so I do want to name that as, and that's why I have like that there's enough distinction, and I've heard and learned, and over my time here in the legislature, appreciated the nuance and distinction that exists between the adult systems and the juvenile systems. The reason for me to be responsive to your question, the reason I have them set up like this is so that they all have to communicate as part of their coordination, and that they, like the members here would then, or I'm sorry, the people who engage in, you know, the adult side, then would figure out how to fill out and engage with community on these different subcommittees, right? Whether there's 1 or 2 or 10 of them, and, you know, engage with advocates and subject matter experts and people with experience here. And that's sort of why I see them as being both. I hope that that's responsive to your question. And it's also part of why I'm thinking to have that there is some, I do appreciate also, Professor Terranova, your suggestion around thinking through what are the points that we would want to, if we meet in, say, January, or if we meet in July or whatever, and say, what is going to be our work for the year ahead? We're going to, together, all of us who care about transformational criminal and juvenile justice reform or whatever, what are the things that we want to, the threads that we want to carry throughout, whether that is, you know, equity, whether that is whatever those things are, right? that is the place where that happens, but then the work happens in its own places.
Right, and so I think that's what we'll do. We'll shut this down. I
Yeah.
think, Senator, you raised an important issue that we haven't even gotten to yet, which is how does community
Mhm.
of outside people tell these circles what they think they should do?
Yeah,
Right,
yeah.
you know, I mean, currently under law, the governor writes a letter every other year, and the governor's supposed to talk to the chief justice, which doesn't happen, so, but anyway. Well,
I didn't have a
whatever.
governor on my picture.
I know, you didn't put the chief justice either, you know, or the speaker or the president, right? Yeah, all right, we're not there yet.
I suppose the definition of transformation is in this group's hands. So we can remove people as you all see fit. I am going to go ahead and move us along to a discussion of duties. I think just to close this one for now, where we are is Chair Kane will probably reach out to several of the members and in addition work with Co-Chair Tom Raines and bring back some options that are informed by all of the ideas here today. We're going to move on to a discussion of duties. And to start this, I'm going to share screen and I'm going to read through first the historic duties of what was assigned to CCJJ. And then we'll go through what's just been a high-level draft framework that Chair Kane has put forward for us. Looking historically at CCJJ, the Commission was given the following duties: to conduct an empirical analysis of and collect evidence-based data on sentencing policies and practices, including, but not limited to, the effectiveness of the sentences imposed in meeting the purposes of sentencing and the need to prevent recidivism and re-victimization. To investigate effective alternatives to incarceration, the factors contributing to recidivism, evidence-based recidivism reduction initiatives, and cost-effective crime prevention programs. To make an annual report of findings and recommendations, including evidence-based analysis and data. To study and evaluate the outcomes of Commission recommendations as implemented. To conduct and review studies, including but not limited to, regarding work and resources compiled for other policies and practices in the criminal and juvenile justice systems. The Commission shall prioritize areas of study based on the potential impact on crime and corrections and the resources available to conduct the work. The Commission shall include among these areas of study the reduction of racial and ethnic disparities with the criminal and juvenile justice systems, and to work with other state-established boards, task forces, or commissions that study or address criminal justice issues. Using empirical analysis and evidence-based data, the Commission shall study sentences in Colorado. The Commission shall establish advisory committees that focus on specific subject matters and make recommendations to the Commission. The Commission, at its discretion, may respond to inquiries referred by members of the General Assembly, the Governor, and the Chief Justice of the Colorado Supreme Court as resources allow. And the catch-all of additional duties as it's signed by the executive and/or legislative branches. And this entire deck will be posted on the website over the next week, and we'll email it directly to all of the members. But taking from that and our discussions to date of the last couple of months, Chair Kane had put together just some ideas for us to discuss, with duties to include evaluate policies that the group recommends, reduce the prison population, crime prevention, violence interruption, sentencing guidelines and practices, disparities in sentences, clarity in sentences, enhanced decisions on resource allocation, data-driven recommendations for sentencing and corrections, review of current crimes and sentences, review of programs and practices, support victims through increased resources, reentry, community awareness and education, outreach to communities and community leaders. And I will flag again that we will have a dedicated conversation still today on the role of communities and stakeholders in these conversations. I'm going to pull this off the screen in about 2 minutes, but Chair Kane, I want to open it to you and then I'll facilitate some input from everybody. But would love to hear from you, Chair Kane, on your thoughts behind this and where you'd like to hear from people about how in-depth your thinking on the duties should be, how much room it should leave for our entities, our circles, our diamonds, our dumbbells and barbells to set what their duties may be.
Thanks, Barrick. I guess what I wanted to be able to do is, as everybody really wants to know what's the work of the commission, and everybody has their issues, should we, bail, I mean, always bail, or population, how do you reduce it without compromising some public safety? You know, victim issues, and and how is it more, see, and I didn't even know how to phrase this. Is it more than just talking about resources? I mean, we have the VRA. Do we need to put anything in there specific? And how do we phrase that about victim resources and et cetera? For me, when we were working with the Sentencing Reform Task Force and we did our listening tour, Tom and I and David Kaplan and Christy Donner, one of the things we heard from all the groups was a more clarity around sentencing, like how much time will people actually serve, and people are confused about that, and how do you approach that, and ways that we can still give earned time and good time, and behavior incentives versus the clarity. I mean, that was one thing. Are do we call them out? Do we just generalize it? How do we do it in duties? Um, uh, and then the big thing is, that we'll talk about more specifically, that we heard in testimony, how much do we specifically want to put in statute about outreach to the communities and what is required around that? Do you just say outreach because that's kind of vague? Do you want to make sure, more specifics around that in terms of the legislative duties? And, one of the things some witnesses talked about in terms of community awareness and education was that a lot of people didn't know about CCJJ, and how do we repair that in this new creation? So, these are things that I copied from other statutes in other states, and some of them overlap, and some of them don't. And then the community was really more. I never saw it in any other states statutes, but it was a big message. So.
And what I will do is, again, I'm going to screen share briefly just to do this one I will hold myself to the lightning round standard. I'm going to go through just some examples of how other states have defined theirs in the forming legislation for them. And you'll see it really runs the gamut on these. I'm not identifying states because I didn't want us to be affected by that. But you'll see that, one state says charged with crafting policy and practice recommendations to the governor, general assembly, executive branch, and state and local stakeholders. Commission is also tasked with allocating federal juvenile justice funding and leveraging other sources of funding to develop and support effective juvenile justice programs and strategies. Another state says the purpose is to review sentencing policies and practices and examine how these policies and practice impact the criminal justice system as a whole. One state says prescribe sanctions proportionate to the seriousness of the offense. You'll see this one gets very specific, and it goes on to say, permit the recognition of the differences in rehabilitation possibilities among individual offenders, forbid and prevent the commission of offenses, prevent arbitrary or oppressive treatment of the persons adjudicated offenders or delinquents, and restore offenders to useful citizenship. One state went the other direction, said what they don't do, does not make recommendations or take positions on specific legislation. This one supports using data-driven analysis and evidence through full system-wide fiscal impact analysis on pertinent proposed legislation, including yearly prison and community supervision population projections, presenting key findings in research reports based on trends seen in the system or requests by council members of the governor, general assembly, or members of the Supreme Court, providing information to support evidence-based sentencing, reporting on statutorily mandated policy reforms, including downward departures for gun possession, sentence enhancements, and the impact of additional pre-sentence investigations before sentencing. The next state make recommendations for amendments to state laws that will reduce the state's current prison population by 25% by 2025. This was in 2018 for context. So it was a 7-year window to accomplish that through maximizing uniformity, certainty, consistency, and adequacy of the state's criminal sentencing structures. The commission's recommendations will ensure that the punishment is aligned with the seriousness of the offense, Public safety is protected through the deterrent effect of the sentences authorized and the rehabilitations of those who are convicted. And appropriate consideration is accorded to the victims, their families, and the community. I have just one more slide that I'll get through quickly. Reports of the commission shall include, but not be limited to, an evaluation of the impact that existing sentences have had on the length of incarceration, the impact of early release, the impact of existing sentences on the length of community supervision, recommended options for the use of alternatives to incarceration, and an analysis of the fiscal impact of the commission's recommendations. The next state. Committee responsibilities are guiding implementation of the changes in law, defining performance measures and recidivism, approving processes for comprehensive data collection to measure performance, recidivism, costs, and outcomes, considering systems for data collection and analyses, ensuring system integration and accountability, monitoring implementation and training efforts, calculating avoided state expenditures by reductions in out-of-home placements to make recommendations to the governor and legislature, and continuing to review topics related to the continued improvement of the juvenile justice system. Our last two states that we have examples. To develop post-implementation monitoring procedures and reporting methods to evaluate guideline sentences, to advise and consult with the Secretary of Corrections and members of the legislature in developing a mechanism to link guidelines, sentence practices with correctional resources and policies, which includes review and determination of the impact of the sentencing guidelines on the state's prison population, to consult with and advise the legislature with reference to implementation, management, monitoring, maintenance, and operations of the sentencing guideline systems, and to make recommendations to the legislature relating to modification and improvement of the sentencing guidelines. The final description of the duties provides an independent review of the state juvenile justice system and provides recommendations to the General Assembly. The council shall actively review the implementation of all juvenile justice reforms enacted by the General Assembly, collect and review performance measurement data, and continue to review the juvenile justice system for changes that improve public safety, hold youth accountable, provide better outcomes for children and families, and control juvenile justice costs. Obviously, a few of those spoke either to juvenile justice or to broader criminal justice. None of these are being provided as proposals or recommendations, but rather as you continue this conversation of duties, to give you an example of the different levels of specificity that different states took in creating their commissions and councils. With that, Madam Chair, if it's okay with you, what I would propose we do is open it up to the members for their recommendations. And I'll leave it pretty broad for you to weigh in on either specific duties that you think it is crucial that are included in being named for the entity or entities to take under their purview, or to weigh in more generally on the type of detail that you think should be in statute or in the executive directions for this versus what they should be empowered to identify as their own duties. On this, I will first open it up to volunteers, and then I will find volunteers if we find ourselves in a quiet room. Director Hilke.
Yeah, the only thing I will say is I like how Maureen compiled a list that's actually able to be done by a commission. The previous duties of the CCJJ were in that list that you read, Barrick, were pretty exhaustive with regards to a lot of study and research. And what it ended up happening is that study and research was done by career staff. We were always sort of constantly above and beyond what the commission could do and had to do that work within the department. And, which goes back to my, some of my original comments is that if we make a recommendation that has, a lot of work like that being done, it has to be properly staffed. So I'm a big fan of keeping it, the duties to the things that a commission that is a part-time commission, occupied by people who have other jobs can do as well. That's the only thing I wanted to mention.
Thank you, Director. Representative Weissman.
Thanks. I appreciate the director's point. It somewhat dovetails with how I was going to break all that down. Going back to the original CCJJ list, and you could say the same thing about the other states that you've collated here. some of these are sort of guiding principles, uh, you know, to look at reduction of racial and ethnic disparities. I mean, that ought to cut across everything. And some of it was a lot more specific. And frankly, if we're talking about the duties of the coordinating structure as opposed to the duties of any individual task force that gets stood up, some of this gets pushed down one level. Do a lit review. Well, I mean, and that first bullet I think was basically talking about the what work study that Brzezowski did in '08. Although I acknowledge that career staff also had a lot of ongoing roles. So without going point by point, where the concept is coordinating versus specific task forces, we could go through everything on all of those slides and kind of sort it that way. And if it's something that is substantively specific, it doesn't go in even the biggest list of what we think the duties of the coordinating structure are. It goes in one of the later task forces.
Thank you, Representative. Volunteers before voluntold.
Well, let me just add a couple other things because I was doing reading last night. To what extent do we give this a duty to move forward with legislation? I think that was brought up by some people. Should this group have bills? And if this group gets bills, I think then in the duty it is to craft legislation that will align with our mission, right? And then the other thing is, somebody actually mentioned it today. I was looking at a national group, and with their work, they were given money for grants, so that does this group ever, or these subgroups or arms or whatever, have the ability to put have grant funding so that they could do pilots for promising practices or whatever, because those are two silos now. Because Matt Shop does a lot of the grant management that comes out in legislation, and there's all this ARPA money that I mean, there is not good coordination with grant funding in the criminal justice world. And so another thought I had that wasn't on this list was, to what extent should this group be engaged in any of that? Or is that just separate government function that they do in their own way, right? So
Let's
that's another
open that
thing.
to the floor because, Madam Chair, you also, and I know I went through a lot of word salads on people's comments, but grants was raised in some of the survey responses of whether this entity should have that. So, would open it up to the group to respond to the chair's questions around legislative authority or the drafting bills, creating bills, as well as grant making or grant administration, or other thoughts on duties that you think are critical that be named, or things that you think should be specifically excluded. And no, Victoria, I'm not going to call on you first. I'm going to start to my right, which means Emily is going to get called out first. And then I will go to Ubaldo and we'll work our way around. Welcome thoughts on whether it's drafting and creating legislation, grant administration, or duties that you think are vital be named explicitly or not included.
I think I'm stuck on the duties right now, which maybe it's easier to come back to after I actually have a formulated thought. But in terms of grants, I think that could be helpful in some ways. But for what? What's the purpose? Is it to pilot programs? Is it to be some kind of funding agency, or is it the ability to apply for grants to help facilitate programs? I think then that loops back to, what is the mission of the group and the scope of what this group does? Or is that delegated to some other group that is recommended by what is created by the entities? I'm not really sure. So that's a wandering thought. In terms of legislative authorities, I think one of the things when you pull together all the experts and the right stakeholders and they can dive into the statutes, I think you have the right key players to draft legislation and get feedback. And it makes a lot of sense to me that that would be one of the rules, but I could be swayed from that point if other people have feedback on that. So.
Sir.
I'd like a lot more time to think about duties, but I like the idea of a bill creating, drafting legislation, because I agree with Emily. I think, especially if this entity or entities is heavily weighted with community experts and not so much system actors, although I know the system actors are extremely important because they have their perspective and expertise. But I like that idea. And I know that some of the duties need to include, I don't know, just some ideas or like looking at reentry, focusing on the Department of Corrections, focusing on community corrections, focusing on public safety, and especially focusing on survivors and victims, for sure. And I just need, I don't know, more time to really think about duties and write them down at this point.
Fair enough. And we can certainly, put together another quick Google form if people want to submit ideas or just email them to Carrie and me. Before I come back to the room, Director Hilke had his hand up. So I want to bring Director Hilke in and then I'll come back to going around the room.
Yeah, I kind of lowered my hand. I thought maybe I'd censor myself, but the only thing that started to pop into my mind about grants is, we should be careful about widening the net too far, right? Because especially in the last several years, there's been a lot of grant programs that have come out of legislation that were born out of ideas from the legislature and born out of ideas from the governor and the departments. And, we could probably spend all of our time just evaluating, the efficacy of those kinds of things. And, I just don't know, how much do we want to take on as a group or whatever. That concerns me a little bit because it seems like we're widening the net even farther.
Thank you, Director. And I'm going to continue to push people on, are there duties that you see you definitely want named? Are there ones that you think are not appropriate to name? And maybe on the legislative side, and just picking up on Director Hilke's caution, I would ask people to contemplate what is the lift of grant administration, particularly those of you who have been involved with it. I'm going to go to Rep. Weissman and then to Senator Gonzalez.
Thank you. I mean, if a member of the coordinating group becomes aware of an opportunity, sure, that's a forum for sharing information. My sense is that the mechanics of applying for and getting and then program managing even a small grant, and I think Emily could probably speak to this, is beyond what is going to be done by this kind of part-time volunteer effort. Backing up out of that for a minute. Duties. We are charged by the EO to make recommendation, ideally in the form of legislation. So if we codify anything, I mean, like we've talked about listening and taking community input. I mean, that's the duty of the coordinating group. There was a question before, how does the coordinating group in the whatever form it takes, we've got different diagrams here, receive from community organizations their senses of what the priorities ought to be for the next 12 to 24 months? Well, they go and they have one or more meetings, and there's language we can look to in the statutes that set forth what that looks like. You're required to do this many meetings, geographic variance, language accessibility, all manner of things. To the point about legislation, I think that when we started this many weeks ago, I sort of presumed that there would be drafting or quasi-drafting authority. I'm not actually sure that that's necessary or best. Of course, the former CCJJ had this weird middle ground where somehow there would be access to the good people in the drafting office. But even if something came out of a task force 100% and went through the full CCJJ 100%, there was not a guarantee that it would ever be introduced. There had to be a bill title allocated by this place in its processes, whether because a member committed one of their 5 guaranteed under the rules or late bill authority was granted. Now, there was a very good track record, not perfect, but there was in fact a very good track record of doing that, but it was still one click short of the way that interim committees work, which is you just get X number of bills. In the 2018 reauthorization, I actually sat where you're sitting and argued to the Judiciary Committee sitting here that that going forward, CCJJ should get bills, a reasonable number, 5 or 6, like any interim committee, and it was rejected, and I didn't push it further. Part of my reasoning, I guess, twofold. Frankly, the closer you are to foreordaining legislation, stakes get higher, battle lines might form up. Ability to hear and listen deeply might wane a little bit. And as I've thought about how does this thing that we're talking about contribute to or gap fill the regular legislative process, one of the shortcomings of the regular legislative process, given the compressed time, given everybody's running around here like crazy, 12 hours a day, is deep listening. That is really something I'm going to keep coming back to in our new thing here. There are alternatives, and actually, your organization, Confluence, has been part of some of them. And I put this in my comments. We had these task forces a couple of summers ago that didn't have bill authority, but there were these pretty intensive facilitated processes to grapple with pretty big questions. How are we going to spend $1 billion on behavioral health? And there was a report, and it, as you're doing now, session by session, it kind of started by inviting a lot of commentary within some broad sideboards and tried to organize it and pack it down and be faithful to how the commentary had gone. And there wasn't bill authority, but those processes certainly powerfully informed bills that did result, leaving a zone of discretion for the legislative process, which again, I'm going to keep going back to. Another one that I put in my comments, and just to share more broadly here, is sometimes we have that kind of process stood up by bill. All right, so a couple of years ago, we had a bill to say, hey, we should get this task force together to make recommendations for a pilot effort to screen survivors of crimes for brain injuries. Emily knows what I'm talking about. There was a report. It wasn't a bill, but it pretty clearly outlines what the major elements of a bill should be. And I consider that a successful outcome. So there are examples of really useful contributions to inform the legislative process and to come with some weight and even deference, to the Director Hookie's point a little bit ago, but that just aren't bills yet. And I'll invite my colleagues here who have been part of the past CCJJ to differ with that, but it's been on my mind lately.
Thank you, Representative. And just to add some color to what you said, and as with anything I say, I don't advocate, I simply share. We have seen a lot of different examples of how different states have approached everything from commissions to task forces to committees. And it's very common for these to be laid out, as we were talking about, of what the duties are and the responsibilities are assigned by the legislature or the executive to any working group or task force. I did recently see one state turn around and point the finger back at themselves in the legislature. And they laid out what a commission was required to do. And then they named what the legislature was required to do with what came from that commission. And in that case, it didn't require them to take action on the recommendations, but it did require them to receive the report and to hold a hearing to address each of those. And my understanding from talking with some of the sponsors was that stemmed out of a frustration of reports coming out of commissions or task forces and going nowhere. So just one example. Senator Gonzalez, to you.
I've been grappling with this idea of
whether bill authority should be granted. And right now I'm going to just stay agnostic on that point, because I think that part of my question actually actually drives to like membership, because as a legislator who served on CCJJ, I actually am excuse me, I'm actually wondering whether legislators, whether the inclusion of legislators actually then lends a political flavor to the conversation that might happen in a different way if there were some space where we weren't there. Just gonna put that out there. And so that question I still struggle with. I don't think that we are elected and carry different levels of interest and expertise and what have you. And sometimes we do have subject matter expertise, sometimes we don't. And I think that we can also take up a lot of space. And so I just want to grapple with that in terms of membership, which I know is not necessarily to your point of structure, of like what we should or should not do. But as we're thinking about these questions of should we be able to have access to bills, that's where my brain goes first. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Senator. And Chair Kane, I'm going to skip over you because I'm going to come back to you and have you close us out on this session after I go around the rest of the room. Ms. Hunter-Holan, to you, your thoughts on duties, whether it's specific ideas to keep away from, or our philosophical approach to them.
I have two thoughts about that. One is if there is an oversight or coordinated, whatever it's called, it should be more broad and you used a phrase. What did you say? Go back to what you said. More philosophical. I think that's what you said. It in nature. I'm the one who brought up the grants. And the reason for the grants was not to study other things, or the purpose was to allow this entity to become its own and to live. So it's not so it can continue. That's what the grants were for the livability of this group.
Just to clarify, so your intent in that idea was raising grant funds to support the entity, not for it to become a grant maker.
Correct.
Thank you.
That was the sole purpose for that. But I think it's important because this group should be what's the word? Quasi-governmental agency that is allowed to do more experimenting, looking at new and creative ideas, and be away from this structure, this legislative structure. So there is more freedom and ability to move within the community, get more involvement, more ideas. So totally different way of thinking with them.
Appreciate the thoughts and the clarifications. Director Stansel, your thoughts on duties?
I'm kind of struggling with this one because in my world, we have to write position descriptions, which outline duties. We have to list all of these different duties. And there's always that risk of forgetting something and not remembering it until something happens. So instead of going with listing what I think should be in there, Um, I think we could sit here for months and not come up with all the duties that we should put in there. But I think a key clause that needs to be in there, and we've seen it, is something along the phrase of other duties as assigned, because there has to be a catch-all. We're kind of experiencing some of that in the department now with some position descriptions. Some descriptions left out that phrase, and now there's challenges. Well, should we be doing these duties, which are duties that are consistent with working in a prison? So that's the thought that keeps going through my mind is we can try to list all of the duties. We'll never be able to do that, but we definitely need to list a catch-all clause in case we forget something.
Appreciate that. Professor.
Floor duties.
I have a couple bullet points. I had the luxury of time to
Sure.
think about this, so
No.
appreciate that. We're going the other direction. I think if we are, and what I gather, right, in our discussions, institutionalizing research into our reform mandates, however this entity does that, I see that in like evaluation of those mandates and then implementation, which are kind of two different things. And from, a grants for those things are very different. I participated several years back on the pretrial task force, and seeing kind of the individuals who made up that task force and their expertise and things of that, grant writing wasn't, or identifying grants wasn't necessarily, is something I think that if we are bringing research into this as a duty for seeing, and I see this as like an advisory committee, right? Then having some entity like that as to support grant writing and advising in that could be very useful in two ways. Having grant writing support at an advising setting would allow for writing grants that would enable mandates to include, 2 years down the road, we want to review what happened with this reform to the impact of the community. From the evaluation standpoint, from the implementation standpoint, an individual and a duty like that, I guess we'll talk about it in that way, would allow for grants and support to be written into mandates, such as, if we institute this program, this is the budget, this is what we would need, and this is kind of the idea of how we would get it, which really links that implementation element to leading to successful mandates. So I see that as, if we are going to institutionalize research, having grants in that format, and I agree, having some sort of financial support for this, understanding that this is a heavy lift of a lot of effort to just coordinate. I mean, what we've done here and what this would be, to have some financial backing for that, financial support we heard in our testimony to make this more accessible for community members to participate, incentives, things like that. I mean, I think we heard that a good deal. So that's one bullet point. I only have a couple. Crafting successful legislation, also understanding in an advisory setting or larger purpose, having an entity that may be non-legislative, having members of that larger advisory committee who are more skilled in being able to draft a bill, right? Whatever that is, seems to be a link that could really enable bringing together the experts in our subcommittees that are really, there to inform the content of the reforms, align that with the process of those reforms becoming real, and being successful. Identifying participants for the subcommittees, I see that as a duty for this reform entity. Maybe not all of the participants, because again, I think kind of identifying gatekeepers, so to speak, and I don't know if that's the right term, but identifying individuals that could be key players in certain subcommittees that would be have the best understanding of the era with which they are experts in, to identify other key players, right? I think that's important, and knowing who to hand that off to. And then finally, I think, and this is more again process, collecting reform priorities from those task forces. I originally, when I noted this down, put identify reform priorities, but I think maybe turning that on its head and having the task forces in charge of, or this advisory committee being in charge of collecting those priorities from the task forces that are or including experts in the areas seems to be a little bit more informed. And then with that, defining timelines for the subcommittees. Because, I think we've heard a lot about, short, specific timelines for these reform efforts. And subcommittees, I think, are going to be really great at identifying those priorities, maybe having an understanding of how long it'll take to put the reform mandates together and who needs to talk to who and all of that. But what the advisory committee could provide would be the other side of it. And we've talked about this of how long it takes for, what the real begin and end parameters are for getting successful legislation together than to decision makers and so on and so forth.
Thank you, Professor. We're just about at time for this session. I think as our other two conversations around mission and around structure, where we need to go, given our statutory or directed timeline, is the chairs are going to need to take all of your input and bring back some proposals to you. Madam Chair, I would give it to you before I pivot us. If there's specific reflections you'd like to share or specific asks you have of anybody to inform you and Tom going forward with drafting something for folks to react to.
So I think I think that a lot of people have kind of talked about what kinds of things they want this group to look at. So I kind of get a sense, even if it's not verbalized here today, about duties. So, I mean, those thoughts, we'll put something in writing and we'll kind of do that. I threw out the last two because frankly, I'm going to be perfectly honest. I'm tired of finding sponsors for CCJJ bills, or I'm tired of going and begging people, will you be on it? Will you be on it? Because there's no bill authority. One year, the speaker, well, in multiple years, the speaker actually said, CCJJ bills do not count against your 5. And so they are treated outside of that. And it was much easier then to find people because a lot of our recommendations came after people already committed their 5 bills. So there was, and then you had to get a late bill and then blah, blah, blah. And it was, it felt, in a way felt disrespectful to the work that the commission was doing to not say that you're as important as interim committees or other standing committees. So, that's my thing. As far as grants, it's just, I think we'll have to think about that because I like the idea of pursuing grants, but there are certain foundations that won't give money to government, entities or whatever. And then, it is frustrating that that we give a lot of money to, there was a lot of frustration about a lot of money going to law enforcement, and not money going to other sides and other things and research and et cetera. So, we'll see if there's any ideas around that you guys think could work or whether we are going outside of our lane, which I think is really important that Stan brought up. And I just want to I know we're out of time, but we didn't have Tristan or Michaela weigh in on duties.
Thank you. Yeah, I was trying to be respectful when our members online went off camera, but Tristan and or Michaela, if you'd like to jump in, would welcome you.
On
I won't take-
duties. Yeah.
I won't take too much time here.
Oh, please.
But I wanted to respond to what the chair was just saying. And Maureen, I certainly understand what you're talking about as far as the difficulty with trying to get sponsors on CCJJ bills, particularly after the first 5 bills have already been committed. But I guess my question here is if the function of this group of the successor entities to CCJJ is going to be to run specific bills, then why do we need the group as opposed to the current system of task forces and interim committees?
Well, my response is, task forces have to be in interim committees get to be chosen about one specific thing, and there is more opportunity through this group to do more thoughtful and research-based change, I think. My experience with interim committees hasn't been as positive. You know, we had the prison population one, we've had other stuff. There's been some changes through them, but they usually don't have a comprehensive agenda. So, and I think what we're trying to do here is the bigger bites. And that's what I worry about. So that's just my
And
thought.
I'm going to also invite Adrian in, who I want to mention, dropped in the chat that the committee definitely needs to have bill authority. I will also, again, this is not my opinion, and I defer to all of you. I will just remind us that we're operating under an executive order to make recommendations for a permanent entity. Adrian, did you want to jump in with additional thoughts?
No, I just did want to just reiterate that, and to Maureen's point, the committee does need to have bill authority because, yeah, being someone who has to run around and find sponsors, yeah, the committee needs to be able to put forth its own bills.
Thank you, Adrian. Michaela, I want to make sure I give you the opportunity if you wanted to jump in.
Sure,
Put
I
on all the
actually
bills, and then
believe
you get
Vince.
stuck with it.
Michaela, you broke up on us. Could you repeat that?
Sorry, I believe Vincent is actually on the call now, so I'll turn that over to him.
Vincent, if you're on, I invite you in. You might be iPhone without a name. If you're on, would welcome your thoughts on what specific duties should or should not be named for the entity or entities.
Sorry, yes, I am on, but I'm driving and I'm not really in a good spot to give feedback right now. I will
Quite all right.
hopefully
Carrie and I will
adjust.
follow up with you. We want you to stay safe, so we'll follow up directly with you. I believe that's all of our members. As I said, I think what we'll do is we welcome you to send further thoughts to Carrie and to me, and we will consolidate those to share with the chairs and to circulate back out to all of you. I am going to take us on our final break of the day. It's 2:59. We'll reconvene at 3:10 when we'll come back and completely shift gears. We're going to be talking about the role of community and key stakeholders in the work of our entities, barbells, and triangles. Members of the public, if you are online and would like to make comments to address this group, we will have an opportunity at 3:40 p.m. And if there's anybody in the room who would like to address the group, you're invited as well. If you're online, if you would drop a chat message to Carrie Steele, we'll get you queued up for comment at 3:40. Members, if you're in person would like to address us, just come up and tap me on the back of the shoulder. We'll get you queued up. Otherwise, it's 3 o'clock. We will reconvene at 3:10.
halfway do something. Okay, let me talk.
Folks to return into the room, and we'll begin here in the next minute to 2 minutes. If we had paused the recording, we can resume. Members joining us online or members of the public, we are back in session for the January 19th meeting of the Working Group on Transforming Criminal and Juvenile Justice. Our next topic and our final comment or topic for today is the discussion on the role of community and key stakeholders. I have no slides. I have limited structure to this because we want all of you to really weigh in. We heard from over 50 different stakeholders, and the majority of them weighed in on the importance of being out in the community, of engaging the community, of making these meetings accessible to the community, and ensuring that affected stakeholders are involved throughout. So with that background and context, going to open it up, and as with our previous discussions, I will wait for volunteers until I need to select them. But the question really is pretty broad. In what ways do you think members of the community and key stakeholders outside of the membership appointments, which we will get to in our next meeting, outside of membership, where do you see there to be a need for involvement with communities and to provide opportunities for communities and key stakeholders to be involved? And I'd encourage you to think of key stakeholders as broadly as possible. That may be community organizations, that may be corrections officers. It may be people we've had a conversation about lived experience being defined broadly. But I'd like to just open it up to the members to weigh in on what should be the role of community and key stakeholders in any and all of the work of our future entities?
I'll
Ms. Hunter
start.
Holland, jump in.
Sure. I really believe that community input is critical whenever a piece of legislation is being looked at to be changed or implemented. And the communities that are invited or we go seek their information about are directly affected by that piece of legislation. So that people are heard. That you know what you're doing before you make a piece of legislation or a suggestion.
If I could, I want to follow up on that because obviously we've talked about the difference between the adult or the criminal justice and the juvenile justice. We've talked about issue specific, whether we've got committees or task forces. What does that look like to you for this group to do its work appropriately? Is it a running list of people that every issue is engaged? Is this group expected to, on each topic, identify which stakeholders are affected or interested? What should it look like?
This group or the task forces should identify which communities would be affected and seek that input.
And just, I want to name that we may look at your suggestion in informing both this discussion about the role of stakeholders and possibly our earlier one about an expected duty of the organization. Other members want to weigh in on either what should be the expectation on the role of stakeholders, what should be the expectation of these entities in engaging them, and what does that look like?
Well, I would say I think it's important to get all of the stakeholders' voices because the decisions we make are going to impact them. So those that are impacted by our decisions should have a voice and their voice should be heard. Now, getting into how we determine or how we reach out or I think, I mean, there's a lot of ways you can do that. You know, we can just advertise the topic we're talking about and seek volunteers or seek input. That can get kind of cumbersome. But I think their voice is important.
I present, and to be clear, I didn't intend my question to ask this group to offer what are the specific tactics to engage them. But I do hope people will just really weigh in on what should be the role of communities and stakeholders in whether it's the decision-making or the discussions and the general work and even planning of work for these entities.
Well, I think it's all of that. I think it's very important that all the community members have a voice and that they should be heard. I feel like it looks like inreach, you know, into the facilities, and it also looks like outreach into the community. So we just need to make sure that we're getting all that information, that there's people that are designated with you know, coming up with signups and making sure that we know who those individuals are that want to be heard, and then we have somebody that's in charge of going in and gathering that information, whether it be into a facility or whether it be into a community center. But I think not only is the entity comprised of mostly folks with lived experience and expertise, but also when we do that outreach into the community, those meetings are comprised mostly of folks that are justice involved and justice impacted.
Thank you, Mr. Chavez. And for those just rejoining us, the question in front of everybody, and it's intentionally broad for you to weigh in where you would like. What should be the role of community and key stakeholders in the work? And I'll invite you to think of the work as issue specific or the longer term work of these entities. And how do you think what comes to mind for you when I say even community or key stakeholders?
So I'd like to jump in here just briefly because it's been something I've been struggling with since listening to the testimony, because there's a dissonance here because everybody's saying, don't make the group too large, but everybody's saying, I don't want to be a token, right? So I don't want one representative. I don't want more. So it's like, well, if we bring relevant people, you may not be able to have 3 of this or 4 of this, so, how do we do that? But then there's the other thing of um, just the listening, before you decide where you're going to go, is the engagement with the community, the listening part of it. So there's also the representation, which may be just like, one defender and one this and one that and one that. But how do we listen on a broader way to churches and community leaders and groups out there? And how do we, maybe it is the duty that, as things are being discussed, there be, public meetings or whatever in the course of making a recommendation, that always has to happen. So those are some of my thoughts about how, we should make sure that that's part of a duty, to do that with community, because, we don't know what we don't know.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to go to Rep. Weissman, and then I'm going to give a heads up to Adrian, Tristan, Director Hilke. I'll be coming online to you after Rep. Weissman.
Thank you. I agree on that last point. At least as to any task force, I mean, they get constituted with, I think, a heavy idea that who is seated in each task force comes with some representative value, and further that they know where and to whom to go to hear more. And I think it was Professor Terranova made an interesting point earlier that function could also be taken up to the coordinating committee. So I have been thinking in terms of, again, we're expected to sort of output, a bill to frame this up. I think that we want to give a good amount of flexibility to each task force because those are meant to be, unique and different. But there should be a duty on each task force, regardless of your membership, regardless of your time frame, regardless of what you're looking at. You have to have a certain number of community meetings out there. And again, we figure out language about language accessibility and virtual accessibility, move geographically around the state if possible, things of that sort. That just has to be baked into the DNA of every task force. And we can debate the details soon. Maybe also annually, there's at the least a public meeting of the coordinating committee. People come forth and say, or here's this web form, or here's an email address, or all of those. What is salient and pressing to you for the next 12 months? I had been thinking about this more at the task force level, but why not also have it inform the task force composition as well? And again, that could be articulated in terms of an affirmative statutory obligation on the coordinating council to do 1 or 2 such input listening sessions, say annually.
Thank you, Representative. I'm going to go to Adrian and then Tristan. Your thoughts on any of the broad question here of what should be the role of community and key stakeholders, and who do you think of, even when I say those phrases?
Sure. So to piggyback on some of the thoughts there in the room, I think that community absolutely needs a voice, and that includes formerly incarcerated. We have means by which we can actually include people who are actively incarcerated as well, victims, survivors, people, family members. I think that there absolutely needs to be input from all of those sections, but I'm not sure that, to Maureen's point, the you're getting to be too big, and then those voices become sort of more token membership tokens rather than being active contributing members. And so I was thinking that sort of the structure that we've had along the way with this forum has been useful, and that maybe one of the things to consider, piggybacking on Representative Weissman's thoughts, would be that prior to set meetings for the committee, that you have a couple of widely broadcast public meetings before the topics or the items for deliberation, discussion, action for the committee are even done, so that community members get the opportunity to have all of their thoughts heard before we ever even start talking about it in sort of a committee forum, so that those are heard before we start talking about that. And I do sort of like the idea of kind of putting out that agenda. I think that's tricky though, because unless we had a full agenda baked out for us at the beginning of a session, and I'm not sure that we would have that, but if we had, hey, we get a governor's letter type authority, and it says this session we're going to be focusing this committee on looking at XYZ issue, then you could set up 2, 3, 4 different types of community meetings, and you could do them regionally, right? We can be virtual. We could say, okay, we're going to hear testimony on these 2 days from, the Western Slope, the Eastern Plains, whatever. And then the actual meeting for this forum is at the conclusion of all of that, so that we get all of that input.
Thank you. Next, Tristan, and then Director Hilke.
Really like what Adrian just said, as well as Rep. Weissman. And I do think, as Mr. Chavez pointed out, it's important to do in-reach as well as outreach. So what Adrian shared, that it is possible to do outreach with formerly incarcerated folks and in-reach with those who are currently incarcerated, is very important. I think it's a great idea to be doing listening sessions and public meetings before the committees or task forces, whatever we're calling them, take on an agenda item. And the overarching principle for me is that if we want to transform things and give voice to community who have not previously had much input in policymaking in this space, then the most important thing is to go looking for input from people who are impacted by the system, as opposed to those who work in and have positions of power within the system.
Thank you, Tristan. Director Hilke, same question to you. And then Adrian, I think your hand's up. I'll come back to you. But Director Hilke, what do you see as the role of community and stakeholders, and who do you fit into that sphere of who are the community and stakeholders to engage?
Yeah, I hear a lot of what we've been talking about, and I think we heard an enormous amount of testimony from community and people with lived experience. Although I will say, I think it was Maureen maybe early on, or Tom, I don't remember, that talked about how do we define community and how do we define lived experience, because that can be defined in a lot of different groups in a lot of different ways. But the more we can listen, the better it will be. It's a challenge. It's a little bit of a paradox, because in order to do more listening, you're going to eat up more time and more meetings, and you're already going to have a full agenda. I don't know how we overcome that, other than just everybody managing their expectations about how long it takes to go through that process. That all does need to occur, as problems are tackled and recommendations are being developed. One of the things that I thought that the CCJJ started doing better at the end, and this was really mostly with the Sentencing Reform Task Force work, was that even after a recommendation was developed, there was a draft of that. And then in between meetings, we hosted online Q&A sessions, and it gave everybody the opportunity to get on there, who would have access to to the recommendation and ask the people that had been working on it, or ask, maybe you wanted to ask a prosecution discipline or a defense attorney discipline a question about it or whatever. And I think that was a successful strategy that we should probably try to recreate as well, or think about adding to the listening, both prior listening to prior recommendation and post recommendation listening and Q&A. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Director Hilke. Adrian, did you want to jump back in?
Yes, that I was going to say basically what Director Hilke kind of just did, that not only do people want to be heard, they want to know that what they said was taken to heart and incorporated. And so, there are ways that you can utilize technology to do this. So, pre-listening, right, or pre-incorporation of information. So you can take in written testimony. There may be ways that you have a listening where people are providing verbal input and also the ability to provide their comments written. But then even more important is that after. So when we have a product, putting that out in some way back to those forums for them to be able to see it and be able to be like, okay, yes, I was heard, or also say, no, absolutely not. That is absolutely not what we said, right? So having those pre and post, I think, is important.
Thank you, Adrian. And with perfect timing, I see Emily raising her hand. I'm going to come back in the room and go around to anybody who has not had the chance to weigh in. Emily, and then I'm going to go over to my left, Professor.
Yeah, thank you. I think Tristan's point is really important about those who are impacted and versus those who are in positions of authority, even though everyone has a lot of input to give. And I think elevating those who are impacted most by the decisions that these groups are making is really important. In terms of community engagement, I do think the idea of having like pre-listening sessions, here's what's on our agenda, here's what we plan to talk about, here's the ideas that we'll be working through. What do we need to know before we dive into these? What would you like us to consider? What's important for us to have at the forefront is going to be really important. And then I think also that when we think about community engagement, the follow through is also important. So it's not just taking information, but it's then reporting back, here's what we did with that information, and doing that report back and having the obligation back to those who gave their time and expertise and stories to the committee to use. And I do think it's a duty of anyone on the committee has a responsibility to do that engagement, to be finding who needs to be a stakeholder, identifying those stakeholders, and then really actively inviting them. And then that kind of leads to that idea around accessibility. So the accessibility around language access and virtual access is really important, making sure we have funding for translators if folks want to participate in language that's not English. And then also advertising. I think like we heard some feedback from the community about we didn't even know the CCJJ existed or what their purpose was. And so thinking about new and different ways to actually elevate the work of this group. So that might be social media, that might be actively doing some advertising about the mission and vision of the group. But I think that's important to get even beyond the reach that members of the committee would have to pull people in to invite feedback.
Thank you. And I just want to name for the interest of this group, you raised virtual access. And for those not aware, I know Representative Froelich has a bill coming that speaks to virtual access to certain government discussions and bodies. So you may want to look at that, and we can certainly bring that to this group. Professor, your thought on the role of community stakeholders and who is community and stakeholders in these discussions we're having?
Thank you. I think we heard a lot of how I've seen this with our testimony and then the site visit that we just did at Project Elevate is kind of two facets of community that I've seen coming to give us feedback. I saw a lot of community advocacy group representatives here testifying. And then our site visit to Project Elevate and kind of in that outreach, speaking with those who have been directly justice involved and so on, similar but very different feedback from those two groups. And so and what I learned from that is I see the real importance in that outreach in getting that latter feedback. And that's really the tough part, right? And I think we heard that, and I think the accessibility comments and feedback we got is really representative of that, in that, we can make our meetings as accessible as possible, but I do think that outreach is really where you're going to get direct feedback on reforms that really matter to the community that aren't interested. And so what that would look like, I think, and who that would involve, what I've heard has been those who are victims of crime, those who have been justice involved in the juvenile system or the adult system previously and currently. I have heard those who are currently incarcerated, that's definitely, or detained, that's definitely a voice that does not get heard. In this forum, it's obviously challenging, and length of sentence, right? Not just those who are those with longer term sentences. Also, I think family members of those who are impacted by the justice system is something I've heard a lot in a lot of the feedback that we've gotten here. And again, understanding that, the ripple effect, right? The waves of impact. I think that all of those, if we're really trying to capture what the community needs are and what the real impact is, I think that could give us a nice start at a comprehensive lens, and maybe starting with outreach of correctional programs in the community, and not who are running those programs or advocating for them, but actual participants or individuals who have participated in them. I think that could be a really unicorn feature of this committee.
I appreciate you bringing us back to the unicorn, and appreciate the depth of those thoughts. As we get ready to wrap up this portion and today's meeting, is there anybody who escaped my volunteering or who would like to volunteer themselves if you've got additional thoughts? Madam Chair, closing thoughts on the stakeholder and community conversation.
Yeah, and this is something that I do think we need to capture in duties. And this has been very valuable, and I've made notes. I do think, again, there's going to be, some friction here because, yes, I would rather do outreach and visit, and yet we're public meetings, and then we want them, all, accessible via Zoom, but these facilities may not have internet, or, so you're always constantly between, two goals, but finding a way to do the visits separate and apart from a public meeting that are informational and gathering information, I think is really important. Because, I don't spend a lot of time in prisons, but lately I've been to a few. Andre knows, and Adrian helped. And so, it's a totally different feeling. We do have the legislation inside group that works through the Corey Wise Center, and that we work with in getting contact with people inside and what their priorities are. But I'm sure visiting with some of these groups would be valuable for everybody, as well as, visiting with some of Emily's people, and just sitting around a table with those people would be helpful too, in terms of making sure as Debbie and I were just talking about, we talk directly to people and where we haven't well served. So, I think we need to do all these things, and as Stan says, and find the time to do them all in a short time, but, that's why it's a unicorn. So, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. With that, we're going to,
Senator
Gonzalez, please.
Thank you. Just one additional potential layer of complication. I think that in the past iteration of this commission, in terms of the CCJJ and how it operated, it received its mandate to go forward and go work based on a letter of issued by the governor. And I don't want to I don't want to continue to make the assumption that that's the way that this group should operate. And and so if the question is, what is the role of community and the key stakeholders? I actually want for those individuals, those entities to help drive the agenda, as opposed to, so what you will hear me say over and over again is actually like the folks who have lived experience, whether that is by working within these systems or by being impacted by these systems, to drive more of this work, as opposed to those of us who are elected officials. I want for there to be that space for those conversations to happen in a space that is less politicized. And so I think for me, that is an important role of this, of non-elected, non-political, non-system actors in helping to drive this conversation.
Appreciate that. And we've captured that. We'll definitely include that clarity. And while I'm not the lawyer in the room, I saw nothing in the executive order that spelled out any obligation of how this entity becomes empowered. The obligation of this group is to offer recommendations on this permanent entity. With that, I'm going to wrap up the working group's discussions for today and go to public comment. After public comment, I will discuss a little bit about our next steps and conversations. For those in the room, those watching the video after the fact, or those online, every meeting of the TCJJ does provide opportunity for public comment. When we invite public comment, I just want to be clear that it is a one direction. This is not the opportunity to engage in a back and forth. We welcome you addressing the TCJJ. If you're watching this after the fact or later, would like to engage and offer your thoughts on the DCJ, the Department of Criminal Justice website is the link to the TCJJ. You can also email tcjj@confluencepsg.com. We are the facilitators for this working group, and we will get those comments and any materials you send distributed as appropriate to the members. I see one hand up. If I could get you to drop a note in the chat letting me know your name, and we'll get you into public comment. First, I have Kristen Hartman, who I'll invite to come on camera if you'd like. And if you would introduce yourself, if you represent any organization or constituency, you're welcome to share that. Otherwise, Kristen, the floor is yours to address the working group for TCJJ.
Thank you very much. My name is Kristen Hartman. I am a graduate student in the Masters of Public Policy program at CU. With a concentration in policy entrepreneurship. I have a BA in Russian Area Studies from the University of Texas, and I'm also a childhood domestic violence sexual assault survivor, homeless at 16. I am also the parent of a service-related disabled veteran left homeless after a SWAT raid while on wait list for treatment. And I know I'm on a timer, so I got a whole bunch and I'm going to try to get it in as fast as I can. My interest in the CCJ began last year when House Bill 23-1258, the actuarial study for drug crime costs in Colorado, was going through the legislative process, passed, and then was vetoed by the governor. Then I started grad school and the class I got into said, choose a policy of interest. Well, anyway, I ended up spending the entire semester started with that 1258 veto, which led me to the CCJJ, which I had never heard of before. So I spent the entire semester on the CCJJ and ended up writing my term paper, which is a policy memo, which I got an A on, by the way. And then in my other class, the economics and public finance class, we had to come up with 2 plausible off-the-wall solutions to a public policy problem. The problem I chose is an effective citizen who has been, I feel, as you've heard, as I've listened to you guys discuss, like many effective citizens, completely bulldozed by not heard, not listened, not considered. So I went back to school to better learn how to do that. Well, so studying the CCJJ, going through all of this turned out to be very, very interesting because coming into the public policy program with a bachelor's in Russian area studies, sorry, that 2-minute thing just went up and distracted me. The thing that jumps out at me is not the differences in our two countries, but the similarities. And what I see and what I heard today, I did not know that the CCJJ had its own, like, didn't have to come out of any of the legislators' bills, counts of 5, which I found to be interesting because that almost gives the CCJ a legislative seat, a vote, in a way, power that we citizens don't have. And one of the conclusions that I came up with in my policy paper was that the CCJJ was a policy monopoly. And the title of my paper is CCJJ versus Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. So, but the good news is, and oh my God, I hate timers because I have so much to say, and you guys have raised so many interesting things. I actually, in my other class, in my 2 off-the-wall solutions to a public policy problem of affected citizen access and inputs, I got an A on that too. And one of the, you can go to policyworkgroups.com, which I just created as a test project 2 weeks ago after getting an A on that paper too. I'm so excited. Anyway, the idea was that if there are affected citizen policy work groups in geographically and topically that worked in an online format, and I was so excited to hear Sheriff, Hilke, you can tell I'm Mesa County, sorry, Mr. Hilke, when he talked about the online Q&A forum, because that would plug right into the whole idea of citizen policy work groups where affected citizens can discuss, legislators can pop in, we can do surveys. So I created this website as a test while I'm in school. Oh, 1 minute, I got so much. And so what I'd love to do is give you a presentation of that when I have more than 3 minutes, because there's a lot of personal stuff that, but anyway, so I posted both my policy papers on that website, and I've started blogging, but I also want to warn you guys, sincerely as an American who has, when I started the Russian Area Studies program, it was the USSR. When I graduated, there was no USSR. This idea of government sanctioned policy monopolies that go between the legislative body and the citizens is exactly what happened. I'm just letting you know that be careful, because I love you all. I just, please be careful, in other words, mission drives funding, and it feels like you guys are trying to find, because the governor told you to, you're trying to find a reason to justify your existence. The fact that you're 3 months into this and don't have a mission boggles my mind, because the governor had to have had a mission, a purpose for creating you in the first place and wanting it to be permanent. So I'm just saying that there's a whole research area here to be careful of in the path to silencing citizen voices. And I heard so many of you, and I was so encouraged today listening to you all talk about recognizing the importance of affected citizens, because I'm an affected family. I escaped from sex traffickers when I was 17. I survived without the system. I survived by avoiding the system. My daughter, on the other hand, joined the Navy, and it's been a mess ever since. And so she's getting SWAT rated. It's a mess. It's a mess. It's a mess. So her trust and belief in the system has been hard for us as affected family. And thank you, Professor, for acknowledging us, because we're those families sent off to anonymous this and anonymous that. And part of my citizen policy work group's proposal is that we break anonymous. We're tired of being anonymous. We have no voice. Why? Because we're anonymous. We have no power. Why? Because we're anonymous. Well, my family, and you can go to the Colorado Women's Bar Association website, they gracefully published my story, Mother Lady Justice, on their blog site in late July, right the day before I got my acceptance to the
Kristen,
CU.
I am sorry to interrupt you. I've got about another 15 seconds. I'm going to need you to wrap up.
Okay, is there any way I could present to you guys the solution alternative to the policy monopoly of these citizen work groups where you guys can all engage, you can pop in and out, you can do surveys, but I would like the opportunity in more than 3 minutes for a semester and a lifetime of survival and work to be able to present to you, because that's the point of my policy paper is citizens only get 3 minutes. You guys spent 3 hours talking about a mission, and I'm supposed to put my whole life and make a case and present to you as a citizen in 3 minutes. And I heard all of you acknowledge that about what you heard, and I'm so excited about that. But there's just so much more, and I feel like I don't know how as a citizen to engage with you on. Please let me make one more
Kristen,
point.
I'm sorry, I am going to have to wrap this up, but I would invite, Kristen, I would invite you to email tcjj@confluencepsg.com if you've got any materials or if you've got additional follow-up, and we're happy to distribute it. At this point in this working group's work, we don't have significant opportunity for longer presentations, but if you'll send those materials to us or any additional links and information, we're happy to distribute that to the full working group. Really appreciate you joining us and offering those thoughts. And I can assure you that this group is paying close attention to everything that you've been sharing. With that, I did see, I believe that's Demetrius Somerville who had your hand up. Demetrius, did you want to address the group again? I believe you had the opportunity in one of our earlier meetings, but did you have some comments you wanted to offer to the group?
Yeah, just a couple. I won't take up much of you guys' time. I know it's been a long day. I've been listening to everything, and I just feel like kind of gray area on the actual main goal. I love the list. I love what you showed, what you shared on your screen and everything. But if the goal is public safety and preventing recidivism, then of course you all know it has to be resources. I'm a just as involved individual myself. With that being said, they know who you are when they lock you up and they fingerprint you and all that stuff, but then they're having problems getting IDs and different things like that. What I would like to suggest as far as the question is concerned is share. You got to be able to share. I heard the grant portion of the talk today and everything. I represent CEO. They gave me an opportunity. I also have a bachelor's degree. I couldn't find a job because of background checks. I'm going to go ahead and push that to the side. So because they shared with me an opportunity to make some money, they're also open up doors for me to find more gainful employment. Okay, so we're doing a pilot called Reentry Cash. With that, I was able to save that money up to buy a car so I can go and get to a more gainful employment job if I got it. So with that being said, with you guys reaching out into the communities, I'm not asking them to give everything, but you know, if you got to make a choice between coming to a CCJJ meeting or possibly making some money, you might want to try to, you know, offer them $20, $30 to come to a meeting. And then once they hear what it's about and how it's going to affect the community, you know, so these are just ideas I'm coming up with. You know, once they hear and see what it is, that's going to motivate them, you know, themselves if they're really concerned with the community. And then you can weed out the ones that's really concerned with, you know, uplifting their community and taking accountability for their actions. And one last thing I'd like to say is whatever happened to paying your debt to society? You know what I'm saying? It seems like we're taking a lot of taxpayers' dollars to lock people up, but we're not using not even 1% of that to make sure people aren't going to come back into the system. So, you know, we need to just pay attention to those little things and to see if we can find a way, you know, just some suggestions I like to make. And that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Somerville. And I can tell you, you had some people nodding along. I want to thank you for sticking with us during a 4-hour meeting to hold out for public comment at the end, and for your continued interest in monitoring and engagement with this group as we go forward, and look forward to you continuing to do so. With that, that does conclude our formal meeting today. I do want to bring us back to what that means we still have to do. Number one will be closing the loop on what we've discussed today around mission. structure, duties. And that's going to involve your chairs taking all of this input and your continued online input to us and consolidating that into something to share back out for response. We also have some remaining topics to discuss, like membership and where this thing may be domiciled, or what, regardless of where it is housed, what its structure and independence and autonomies will need to be in that. I do just want to remind this group that we have to make these recommendations by March 15th, which realistically means we're in drafting mode by mid-March, or early to mid-February, I believe, Madam Chair. But I'd welcome your thoughts. All that to say, I know each of these conversations, frankly, could be its own 6-hour meeting, and we could probably take these for 6 months. We have an obligation to deliver your recommendations by March. So we're going to move aggressively to share these draft ideas for you to respond to. We'll reconvene on February 5th and be talking about membership and some of the independence or autonomy aspects. In the meantime, we will get everything, including the video and all materials from this, posted on the TCJJ website by the end of next week. You're also always welcome to email us again at tcjj@confluencepsg.com. If you're a member, you should have our direct email addresses as well as our phones if there's anything we can do to support you. Otherwise, that concludes the formal business, and I'll hand it over to Chair Kane with any closing remarks and to close us out.
No, thanks. Thanks to everyone. I'm ready. It's 4 o'clock on Friday. So